A Fairy Tale Marriage by Mary T. Williams. A romancely exclusive story. Get more free romance audiobooks at romancely.com. Blurb. A paranormal, werewolf shifter, arranged marriage romance book. Fairies and werewolves shouldn't mix. At least that's what fairy princess Althea thought before her marriage to the werewolf king Braxton. But their kingdoms depend on their union, and Althea will never turn her back on her people. As they embark on this unexpected journey, their marriage evolves from mere convenience to a passionate romance. However, lurking in the shadows are evil forces planned to destroy everything Althea and Braxton hold dear. Will their love prove strong enough to survive the danger? Or was their marriage of convenience doomed from the start? Find out in this fairy and werewolf romance story by Mary T. Williams. Chapter 1. From afar, the castle in the center of the werewolf kingdom was gloriously, beautifully, frightening at night or during a storm. The turrets reached the sky and were topped with howling wolves rather than snarling gargoyles. The walls were formidably thick and impassable, gray and strong, and the gate impressively decorated with the symbol of the werewolf, a circle representing the full moon with the vague outline of a wolf howling inside. When the gate opened, the circle was halved, but when closed, the shape impressed visitors with the dangers that may lay inside. The gates were rarely closed, werewolves had few natural enemies. A long bridge across a deep culvert led from the road to the castle's gates and was more often than not filled with travelers visiting the castle for various reasons. If under attack, the castle would be impossible to enter, and those inside could live for quite some time without leaving. The self-sustaining interior was a source of pride for the werewolf society, which is why so many traveled to it. Inside, large tapestries covered the walls depicting the history of the lycanthropes, including the most popular story of all, Romulus and Remus, the twin sons of the god of war who were suckled by a wolf and who were considered to be the first werewolves. Other tapestries depicted stories from this kingdom's history. One in particular drew the eye for its violence, the famed battle with the fairies, won by the werewolves, who had taken over the larger portion of the kingdom. Beheaded fairies lay on the ground with werewolves snarling at the few survivors huddled against a wall of gray stone. Bright red thread dominated the lower section of the tapestry, representing the fairy blood spilled and the wolves' triumph. The king of the werewolves, Braxton, paused as he walked through the hallways from his room to his office and stared at the tapestry, frowning. Now that he was king, he could have the horrible thing removed, but there was not another to replace it. He had always hated the reminder of the werewolf's violent past. He made a mental note to commission a new tapestry, something more pleasing to the eye. He ruminated on the subject of the new tapestry as he continued his journey to his office and found Blake, his best friend and head advisor, waiting for him. "We've much to discuss today," Blake informed him gravely before he had the chance to pour himself a coffee. "Could I have a sip of caffeine before you bombard me with terrible news?" Braxton asked in an irritated voice Blake knew was mostly bark, little bite. "I know you've already had coffee this morning with your breakfast. Therefore, we can begin our day before you've laced that cup with so much sugar your eyes should pop out," Blake replied as he opened the folder sitting in his lap. Braxton raised an eyebrow at him as he spilled 3 spoonfuls of sugar into his coffee. "Am I the king? I forget sometimes. Specifically when you speak." Blake chuckled at the joke he'd heard more times than he could remember in the last 6 months. "You are. But as your advisor, I have the right to remind you of your duties." "I feel as if I'm being henpecked," Braxton grumbled as he took his sweetened coffee to his desk and plopped down in the oversized chair, careful not to spill a drop of the precious liquid. "I don't need to get married. You'll peck me to death before a wife ever has the opportunity." Blake rolled his eyes. "One day you'll have to come up with a new metaphor." Braxton sipped his coffee calmly as he looked at the maps laid out on his desk. He gestured to them with his empty hand. "What is all this?" Boundary disputes are beginning to cause a serious issue, specifically in the East, Blake told him, not bothering to point. Braxton's uncanny intelligence was why he'd been chosen of the three candidates as king. His brother and sister, while both intelligent, were not up to the task of running this kingdom. Braxton's mother had ruled the werewolf kingdom with an iron fist for 20 years after her husband had died. Many had expected her to take her 3 children and walk away from the castle, but she had wanted her children to have the opportunity to rule, regardless which one was eventually chosen by the people. As they had grown, she had watched them, as had the public, and when her death was near, she had supported Braxton's ascension to the throne. His sister, Jasmine, had no interest in being queen, wanting instead to marry and be with her children, so she hadn't been considered. His brother, Jonathan, had a violent temper and a love of fighting, neither of which were good assets for a king to possess. Smarting from the rejection of both his mother and the people, when Braxton, the youngest of the 3, had been chosen king, Jonathan had left the kingdom, promising to return eventually when his younger brother asked him not to go. The East, huh? Near the ferries, Braxton mused as he rose to bend over the maps so he had a better vision of what he was looking at. Always the ferries, Blake told him. Their numbers have grown in the last decade, as you know, and they want more land. Because their land ends at the sea, of course they want to expand in this direction. Braxton pulled a writing utensil out of his drawer and marked the fairy castle, the werewolf castle, and drew a long line where the border divided the 2 kingdoms. He frowned and looked up at Blake. Have you seen how little land they possess? Blake nodded, a small smile on his face as he prepared himself to listen to an example of Braxton's sense of justice. I have. Braxton narrowed his eyes. We stole their land a century ago, weakened them by lessening their numbers. Is that correct? Yes, Blake nodded. He waited in silence. Braxton straightened. Are there werewolves on this section of land here? He pointed to a region due west of the fairy castle. Blake rose and looked at the section, considering for a moment. As far as I know, that's mostly woods. If no one lives there, or if there are very few, we could offer this area to the king as a sort of peace offering. I know there have been a few skirmishes that have led to violence, Braxton added, pointing his finger at Blake. Blake nodded his agreement. There have been, and from what I understand, these skirmishes have been escalating and becoming more prevalent. But just handing over land? The people won't like it. Braxton sat back in his chair, coffee in hand, and wondered how he would be able to appease both his own people, who trusted him to care for them and their needs, and the fairies, who were causing problems up and down the border. Parceling out land was probably not the best idea, but the fairies needed space for homes just like werewolves did. What a nightmare, he murmured. Do you have anything more pleasant to deal with this morning? Blake chuckled again. Sorry, boss, this is the most pressing issue we have at the moment. No criminals to try, beheadings, or punishments to dole out. We could begin planning your birthday celebration, Blake pointed out. Braxton groaned. Let's deal with the border crap. Blake laughed loudly as a knock sounded on the door. Come in. A messenger stepped in, straight from his travels. He hadn't bothered to find clothes after shifting from his wolf form to his human form but had come straight to the castle and Braxton's office with mud still clinging to his feet. His nudity was not even noticed. Many of their people loped around in human form nude, although it was mostly the country folk who did that. Those who lived in the more urban areas wore clothes most of the time. Braxton lifted an eyebrow, a gentle smile on his face. Good morning, sir. You must have important news indeed to come see me immediately after returning. The messenger smiled in return and answered a little breathlessly, Yes, sir. I have news from the border. Braxton and Blake exchanged a look, then returned their attention to the messenger. Yes, what is it? Blake asked as he rose to his feet. There has been another breakout of violence on the border near the river. 2 fairies and 1 werewolf have been killed. Braxton hissed out a breath and slammed his hands down on the desk as he, too, stood. 2 fairies and a werewolf. Damn. The messenger glanced at Blake, who nodded for him to continue. A rumored uprising of the fairies is all anyone can talk about there, and the werewolves who live there are getting skittish. They're arming themselves against the fairies' magic. Arming themselves? Braxton exploded. How? With what? Some elves have taken the initiative, so to speak, and are selling weapons or armor that is supposedly resistant to fairy magic, the messenger told them with a roll of his eyes. Amazed, Braxton said, and people are falling for that nonsense? Yes, sir. They believe the lies the elves are telling. That they bewitched the sword or the shield to repel the fairy magic, the messenger replied. God's breath, this is absurd, Braxton huffed. Absurd, yes, but we're talking about simple country folks, Braxton. The werewolves who live on the border are uneducated and superstitious, Blake reminded. Braxton nodded at Blake and spoke to the messenger. Thank you for the information. Go get some clothes and some food. Yes, sir, the messenger answered, bowed slightly, and left the room, closing the door behind him. Blake watched Braxton with a wary eye. His face, so handsome, was mottled with red. Braxton, do not have an aneurysm. I cannot deal with that right now. Braxton released a breath that sounded more like a bark. He sat down and looked across the desk at Blake. That's the 3rd time this month that something like this has happened. And it's escalating. 3 deaths. Braxton began rubbing his temples with his fingertips. What the hell are we going to do? At this rate, either the fairies or our own people will be calling for war within a month. I have a crazy idea, Blake said after a moment of silent pondering. Bracing himself, he spoke. Perhaps you should travel to the border where the skirmish took place. Braxton looked at him skeptically. What for? Your presence handling this issue would make a bigger impact than sending a messenger or a liaison. The werewolves need to see you are a hands-on king, that they've made the right choice. And the fairies need to see that you're willing to work with them but not be run over by them. Blake, ever the politician and diplomat, looked pleased with his plan. Braxton watched the smug smile on Blake's face and hated to admit he was right. Blake was almost always right. All right, Blake. Let's make our travel plans. Our travel plans? Blake asked. Of course. I'll need my trusted advisor by my side, Braxton informed him. The smug smile became less smug. Blake did not like to travel. He preferred the comforts the castle had to offer. Blake sighed. I'll get on it. We'll leave in the morning. He rose and shuffled to the door. I pray to the gods for a decent inn. I am in no mood for tents. Braxton grinned to himself as the door closed behind his friend. He took a sip and began running scenarios through his mind. Across the wide expanse of werewolf land, the king of the fairies, Tristan, paced in his chambers, his anger over the skirmish between fairies and werewolves forcing him into privacy so he did not say or do something unkingly. His beard and hair, white as snow, belied his age, making him look like a wizened leader with much experience. He had ruled the fairies for nearly 30 years, and the hatred between the fairies and werewolves had only grown. His wife, Mariah, watched him, trepidation in her eyes. He was far too old to allow his blood pressure to rise because of anger. Dear, calm down. I know this is bad news, but it's not the worst news, Mariah said, her soft voice, which usually acted as a balm to his anger, having no effect whatsoever on her husband. "Too dead," Tristan bellowed again after a moment of silence in which his wife thought he might have settled a bit. "Those damn werewolves bring violence wherever they go. What the hell were they doing on our land?" Mariah, always reasonable, countered. "Dear, they weren't on our land. The skirmish took place in the neutral border zone. You know that." She had been painting when he burst into the room, interrupting her tranquility with his bellowing. The danger of a heart attack seizing her husband over, she returned to her canvas as she spoke again. "The only way to settle this dispute between us and the werewolves is a treaty." Tristan watched her as she serenely painted what looked like a cotton ball on the sky she'd already painted. Her beauty struck him yet again. Even at nearly 50, she exuded an aura of contentment and loveliness. He sighed and wished he could be as calm as she all the time. As he considered the possibilities of her suggestion, their daughter, Althea, burst into the room. "Father! 2 fairies have been killed by werewolves. Something must be done." Althea, her shining blonde hair swinging around her shoulders, stopped abruptly in front of him. Tristan sighed again and wished his daughter were more like her mother than him. "Yes, Althea. I'm aware of the situation and am considering our course of action." "Course of action? Shouldn't this mean war?" Althea asked. "Good heavens, no, Althea," her mother exclaimed. "War is the absolute last thing this kingdom needs. Besides, a werewolf was also killed." Althea frowned at her mother. "But shouldn't we stand up for ourselves? The fairies are squished into this small section of the kingdom like sardines in a can. We're practically living on top of each other." Mariah looked at her daughter blandly. "Young lady, you live in the castle in your own suite of rooms. Do not presume to sound so put upon." Rather than act properly chastised, Althea winked at her mother. "But I feel bad for the rest of the fairies, mother. It's not fair to them." Mariah chuckled quietly. "You've always been empathetic to the needs of others, Althea. Your best quality, actually." "Thank you, I guess," Althea answered skeptically and returned her attention to her father. "Father, I don't really understand how the werewolves could have killed fairies. I mean, we can fly, use magic, and change size at will. Why couldn't the fairies have become giants and squeezed the werewolves until their heads popped?" "I don't know where she gets these violent tendencies," Mariah muttered, looking at her husband with an arched eyebrow. As a child, Tristan had filled Althea's head with the stories of wars between the fairies and werewolves. She had loved them, especially when he added the gory parts. "I have no idea, dear," Tristan replied with a wink at his daughter. "And Althea, there is a certain honor to be upheld when in battle. One does not use weapons the opponent does not possess. That would be dishonorable. They have weapons we don't. Those claws, those teeth, and their strength," Althea reminded him, ticking off each weapon on her fingers. "We can use our magic to change ourselves so that the fight is more equal, of course," Tristan told her. "However, using magic against them while they are in werewolf form is a waste of energy. They are impervious to it." Althea snorted derisively. "We can fly," she said defensively. "Why are you asking these questions?" "You know all this, Althea," Mariah reminded her gently. I know, Althea grumbled as she tossed herself in a large armchair close to her mother. "At least we can even the odds by becoming tigers or something. Slash their throats with our claws." Tristan chuckled. "For someone who has never been in a fight of any kind, you certainly are fierce." Mariah laughed with him. "And really, Althea, is that any way for a princess to speak?" Althea rolled her eyes at her parents. You two are kind of mean, you know that. Yes, daughter, but we've raised you to be strong, Mariah reminded her. The joviality warmed Tristan's heart, and he was loath to end it with his next words. But end it he must. I've decided to make the trip to the border to handle this issue myself. Mariah's brush slowly lowered from the canvas as she turned to look at him. His daughter exploded out of the chair, her words out of her mouth, as he would have. What? That's ridiculous. You're the king. That's exactly why I need to go. He began to pace around the room again, his frown marring the gentle features of his face under his lengthy beard. The tension between the fairies and the werewolves continues to grow. My presence, I hope, will help ease that, at least on our side. What about those damn werewolves? Althea hissed, throwing her arm out in the general direction of their castle. Language, Mariah murmured, unperturbed. She did not feel it necessary to speak on the subject at hand, her daughter would make their position clear for her. Sorry, mother, Althea said automatically, her eyes not leaving her father. Just because our people choose to be civilized does not mean those barbarians will behave. You could be in danger if you go. Althea, you're being ridiculous. I'll take my guards with me. Tristan smiled at her, then her mother, hoping to reassure them. Both women stared back at him. I'll be fine, my girls. You don't have to worry. Mariah spoke up, her voice still quiet, though stronger than either her daughters or husbands, who listened carefully when she spoke. The only way either of us will feel better is if you take us with you. Tristan sputtered. Althea clapped her hands joyfully and said, Yes. I've never been to the border. I'd love to see that part of our land. That is a terrible idea. Who knows what the conditions will be where we'll have to stay? Tristan told them. Mariah raised a finger. You forget, dear husband, that I'm from that region. I know the perfect inn we could stay at. Good food, soft beds. It will be perfect. She rose from her painting and gently laid the brush down. If you think it's so dangerous for me, why do you assume the two of you will be safe? Tristan shook his head. No. The two of you will stay here. We'll have the guards to watch over us, just like you said. She looked at Tristan, eyebrows raised in question. Besides, your daughter, who you hope will take the throne in a few years, needs to see her kingdom. Althea could sense that her mother would win. She turned her face away so her father wouldn't see the secret smile she exchanged with her mother and waited for his inevitable capitulation. The new king of the werewolves will be there, I'm told, Mariah said suddenly. Tristan stared at his wife. How do you get your information? I only found out about the skirmish 20 minutes ago, the king's visit a few minutes before I came in here. Again Althea smiled. Her mother, as quiet as she was, could be a formidable adversary. She somehow knew everything. Althea didn't know where or how she got her information either. Sometimes she wondered if her mother was a clairvoyant. Mariah shrugged her shoulders as she wrapped her arms around her husband's waist. Never mind, love. This journey is a good idea. We can discuss the idea of a treaty with the new king. Braxton, I believe his name is. Tristan looked down at her and kissed her forehead. That is his name. You amaze me, my dear. Althea sidled up to his side and put her arms around both her parents. You need us there, father. We're your best advisors. Tristan chuckled. Your mother is, anyway, he teased. Althea playfully narrowed her eyes at him, and he winked at her again. Fine. You can both go. Althea clapped her hands. Yay! I can't wait to see the border. And this king. I've heard he's not so hard on the eyes. Oh, really? Mariah turned to her daughter. I've heard nothing of the sort. I, too, have informants, Mother, Althea called as she walked out of the room. I'm going to pack. Chapter 2. The border area stretched for about 1/4 of a mile and was determined by a river whose water always ran clear. Except when the blood ran in it. This 1/4 of a mile was considered neutral territory by both the werewolves and the fairies, so both would visit the river to fish, swim, and have fun, each on their own side of the river. The area was beautiful, a nature lover's paradise with its various species of trees, birds, and other animals. Braxton remembered coming here as a child. Back then, the werewolves and fairies had got along. On the last camping trip his family had taken before his father died, Braxton and his siblings had played with the fairy children who were also camping at the river. The fairies had shown them their magic, and the werewolf siblings had shifted and let the fairies ride on their backs. They'd had so much fun playing together. He shook his head as he shifted into his human form. Memories were only that. He couldn't bring the past into the present no matter how much he wished for it. Better to face the problems at hand. Blake shifted next to him and brushed himself off with his hands. Werewolves always traveled in wolf form, horses were too skittish around them so were raised only for racing and meat. Seems pretty peaceful, he observed. Let's get dressed. The fairies are not as comfortable with our nudity as we are. They used to be, Braxton murmured as he stood proudly, hands on his hips, watching the slow movement of the water as it flowed. Blake looked at the nostalgic look on his friend's face and nodded. Yes, I remember. Simpler times. Braxton looked at him, a grin splitting his face. We sound like old men, not two men nearing 30. He shook his head and chuckled, repeating, simpler times. With a friendly slap on the back, Blake replied, that's what happens as you get older. Your past suddenly looks brighter and more promising than your present. Not always, Braxton answered as he watched a clothed werewolf, a man who lived here, approach them. Good morning, sir. The man bowed slightly, something Braxton hated but had been told to leave alone. Good morning, King. We are happy that you are here to help us. Are you the leader of this clan? Braxton asked. He also wasn't supposed to let the common people use his first name, another part of this whole king business he didn't like. He felt it separated him from the others, which was actually the idea. But he had drawn the line at ridiculous titles such as Your Highness. Word had spread, even out here, that he preferred just King. I am, the man replied and held out his hand for a shake. Jacob, sir. Braxton shook his hand and indicated Blake. My second, Blake. The pair shook hands, exchanging the necessary niceties. The fairy king and his retinue are also on the way, King. They should arrive in an hour or so, Jacob told him. Braxton arched a perfect eyebrow at Blake, who shrugged and said, This is actually a good thing, Braxton. Perhaps the two of you can sit down and have a calm discussion about how to end the violence between our people. I like that idea, Braxton murmured. A servant stepped forward and handed Braxton and Blake bundles of clothes. They began to dress, and Braxton spoke to Jacob, Where is the family of the werewolf who was killed? The tavern, I'm sure, sir. He had a wife but no children, although she is pregnant, sir. Braxton frowned. The widow was left alone with a baby on the way. He glanced at Blake, who understood the look instantly. The king would provide for the woman and her child, possibly offer her a position at the castle should she wish to take it. Blake leaned close. I'll take care of her, sir. Thank you, Blake. His clothes on and adjusted for comfort, he spoke to Jacob again. I'd like to meet her. Of course, King. Right this way. Jacob led them towards a nearly invisible path that led through the woods that surrounded the village. Not 100 yards inside the forest, and completely hidden unless one walked along the particular path, was the village this clan had built. Small but clean, the village had perhaps 10 little cabins, all sturdily built, and the tavern, a lovely little building that could hold every member of the clan and another dozen visitors as well. Everything was made from wood carefully culled from the forest around them. A handful of young werewolves scampered around in their wolf forms, growling and nipping at each other playfully, but they froze when Braxton and Blake, who had traveled with only a handful of others, stepped into the clearing. A woman, one of their mothers, Braxton presumed, waved her hands at them and told them to go play elsewhere. Braxton waved to them as they ran away, barking gleefully. The woman watched him enter the tavern, and slowly, she followed, along with several others from the village. Inside, the tavern was charmingly decorated with taxidermy made from all sorts of woodland creatures, even a few Braxton didn't recognize right away. Strange animals must live in this part of the kingdom, he mused. Everything inside was also made of wood, and the place was much cleaner than one would expect. Braxton spied the widow immediately. She sat in a rocking chair, also wooden, her belly protruding and almost resting on her lap. She was near her time. Her hands rested on her belly, and though her eyes spoke a sadness Braxton could not relate to, she seemed content. He walked to her and knelt, laying his hand gently on the arm of the chair. She smiled at him and put her hand on his. Thank you for coming, King. I'm Lay. Lay, it's a pleasure, although the circumstances are not. Braxton spoke to her in a quiet voice, following the usual custom of speaking quietly to a grieving person. But you're going to fix that, aren't you? She asked quietly, her eyes calm though strong. The violence has to end. My child will grow up without a father, and there are 2 fairies whose families must continue on without them as well. It has to end. Surprised by both her empathy towards the fairies as well as her fierceness, he squeezed her hand. The Fairy King is on his way here. I plan to work with him until this situation is handled. Lay sighed in relief. I hope so. Lay, I know you've been left on your own here. I would like to offer you a position at the castle, where you and your child will be well cared for. You can work there, live there. Lay laughed, a tinkle of a sound that was both charming though a little grating at the same time. If she took a position at the castle, he would make sure it was not serving him. What a wonderful offer, King. But I'm not alone here. She gestured at the clan members around them. I'm well taken care of, as will be my child. But thank you so much for the offer. Braxton smiled, rose, and looked around at the clan members. Werewolves were known for being fiercely protective of their own. No one in the clan suffered if the others had plenty. Braxton addressed the group. The violence will end, I promise. The Fairy King and I will find a way. A werewolf with a large bruise on his face stepped forward. King, the fairies began the skirmish. I'll be honest, we weren't innocent either, calling insults back and forth across the river with them. But they flew across the river and attacked. Several werewolves grunted in agreement. Braxton nodded. I'm sure the fairies will tell a similar story with some modifications. Several chuckles erupted throughout the tavern. Truth is, it doesn't really matter who began this one, or the one before or the one before. It's time to end them. Quiet yes and I agrees could be heard. The clan was tired of fighting every time the fairies were around. Peace was more profitable, in their minds, and much less deadly. Braxton was thankful the clan wasn't one of the more violent-minded clans. Most of them lived in the north and battled with ogres just for the fun of it. Here was a peaceful group of people who wanted to live their lives without the danger of a fight breaking out every other day. And Braxton meant for them to have it. "Let's have some ale while we wait for the Fairy King." Cheers erupted around him, and the liquid began to flow freely. Braxton enjoyed only one mugful. His mind needed to be clear when the Fairy King arrived. And just as that thought crossed his mind, he heard trumpets blaring the arrival of the Fairy King. Braxton rose, brushed off his clothes, clean because he had not traveled in them, and gestured for Blake to follow him. Tristan stood on the fairy side of the river, still fairy size, which was about 7 inches. The area was beautiful, with the river flowing quietly between rocky shores and green hills. The forest rose high on either side, but the fairy side was much thinner. His people were running out of room to live, to build, which was the reason behind the hostilities with the werewolves. His trained eye had picked out the werewolf king's shape across the river. It was time to settle this dispute. Before they'd arrived, Tristan had asked his wife and daughter to remain hidden in the trees closest to them. Althea had agreed to easily, with almost no word of argument. He hoped the mule-headed girl would do as she was told. The wolves could be dangerous. The same could be said for some of his own people. As they had traveled through the kingdom, several of the fairies had stopped him and asked to speak with him. The ones closest to the skirmish were the most interesting to speak to. They claimed the werewolves had taunted them to the point of losing honor had they not defended themselves. The king possessed a more judicious ear. The fairies had begun the fray and lost. When he had attempted to point this out to the group of men around him, they had argued their side, claiming they had responsibility of honor to all fairies. Tristan had looked at his wife and daughter, both of whom had rolled their eyes. He had turned back to the group and told them, "Because of your folly, I am now forced to apologize to the werewolf king on your behalf. You will not begin another fight, or you will pay the consequences under my law." The men had looked like chastised schoolboys staring at the ground in embarrassment. Tristan almost expected them to shuffle their feet and cough. He had flown away without a backward glance, his retinue close behind. Mariah had smiled at him. She knew he hated to speak harshly to his people. He watched as the young werewolf king, an impressionable, handsome man, stepped out of the tavern and waved to him. With a handful of guards, Tristan flew over the river to discuss the possibility of a treaty with the new werewolf king. From her perch in the tree close to the river on the werewolf side, Althea stared at the werewolf king. "Wow," she thought. "Too bad he's a werewolf, because that guy is gorgeous." She was grateful her father hadn't specified which trees to hide in. She had wanted to be close enough to hear the discussion, not just watch from afar. And thank the gods she had. That werewolf king was meant to be looked at. As she watched, her father magically grew to the size of a human as soon as he landed. He tucked his wings back and walked forward to greet the king of the werewolves. While she stared, she did not see her mother fly and land next to her. "Althea!" Her mother's tiny voice hissed. The size of a small hummingbird, their voices were higher pitched, almost the pitch of a dog whistle. "Mother! You scared the magic out of me." Althea returned, her hand on her chest. "What do you think you're doing?" "Your father told you to stay in the trees," Mariah reminded her. Althea smiled. "I'm in the trees." Mariah cocked an eyebrow at her saucy daughter. "He did not mean these trees." "He didn't specify." Althea's smile remained in place when her mother frowned. "Besides, I wanted to hear their conversation." "And did you see that werewolf king?" "Wow." Mariah stared at her daughter, then chuckled. She glanced in her husband's direction, spying the werewolf king. Her eyebrows shot up, her eyes widened, and she giggled like a girl. He is a sight. Althea returned her eyes to the handsome king. His jet-black hair was slightly longer than the men around him, and perfectly straight. She wondered if when he shifted his fur was the same color as his hair. His skin was tanned a lovely shade of brown that contrasted wonderfully with the pale-skinned fairies around him. Her father looked like a ghost next to him. She wondered what his skin felt like. She imagined her hand on his arm, the small, pale hand against his dark skin, the hair there bleached by the sun. And his lips! The lower lip was thicker than the top and looked positively kissable. His shoulders were broad, his waist trim, and everything about him exuded strength. When the voices lifted in greeting, Althea focused her attention on the two kings, hoping for a peaceful solution. Tristan had hopes for peace, although his pride sometimes barred him from smart thinking. That's why her mother usually sat with him during his meetings. She was his wife, yes, but also his top advisor. Mariah, though she had chided Althea for sneaking to the werewolf's side, was glad she had disobeyed. "Welcome, King Tristan, and thank you for coming to this side," Braxton said, extending his hand to the fairy. Tristan stepped forward and shook the new king's hand. "It is a pleasure, King Braxton. But may I suggest we drop the formalities?" Of course," Braxton said with a smile. So far so good, he thought. "Would you like to go into the tavern? The owner has offered to clear it out for us. Please don't be offended, but I think the neutral territory here is a better place." Tristan's tone was kind, not abrasive. "I understand perfectly," Braxton replied. "Let's get down to business then. Before you begin, I'd like to tell you that I spoke with the fairies involved, and though they won't admit to being the culprits behind the physical part of the fray, I am sure they are responsible. However, your people were not entirely innocent, just as mine weren't." Braxton nodded. "I agree. However, my people only hurled insults, not punches. I admit they shouldn't have been yelling, but your people flew across the river onto our land and attacked." Tristan's face had grown redder as Braxton spoke. Althea wondered if her father would be able to maintain his cool. What Braxton said had merit. The fairies had attacked physically. She wasn't sure what part of the statement had angered her father. "Your land?" Tristan repeated, and Althea understood. She and her mother exchanged worried looks. "A century ago this land belonged to the fairies. Your people attacked and pushed us over the river." Braxton's brow knit. A man stepped forward and spoke quietly in his ear. Handsome as well, Althea wanted to ask her mother if all werewolves were handsome, but a gathering of them had begun to form around her father and Braxton. Just like fairies, werewolves came in all shapes and sizes. "Sir, if you'll pardon me, but you need to check your historical facts. The fairy army crossed the border and killed several unarmed werewolves. This act began the war between us." Braxton stepped forward. "But that's all in the past. We should focus on the problems we have now." "Yes, the problems we have now," Tristan repeated, his finger pointing at Braxton. "The problem we have now is that the fairies have run out of room, and your people have more than enough land. We're living on top of each other while you and your beasts live freely." Braxton growled in his throat. "Tristan, this meeting is supposed to be civil. Referring to my people as beasts crosses a line. Those beasts," he pointed at the men with bruises who had obviously been involved in the skirmish, "killed one of my fairies. They must pay." "That fairy was killed in a fair fight," Braxton maintained. "Had one of your little people killed a werewolf, we would not be screaming for payment." "How dare you question my honor? You're a child!" Tristan bellowed. Althea and Mariah gasped at the same time, shocked that this was escalating so quickly. Althea asked, "Mother, should we do something?" "Not yet, love," Mariah answered. "Hopefully your father will regain his senses before this gets out of hand." "You mean further out of hand," Althea muttered. "Child?" Braxton huffed. "I am as much a king as you are, sir, and deserve the same respect." "When you have proven yourself a good king, I'll give you the respect you deserve," Tristan replied. Braxton's body began to shake. The primal need to shift, to defend his honor, pricked his mind and his ego. Blake's hand on his shoulder held him in his human form. He pointed his finger at Tristan. "Listen here. I have nothing to prove to you. I am king of the werewolves, and I rule this kingdom. You are here." Tristan tilted his head, flicked his wrist, and Braxton was forced back a step or two, halting his words. Braxton put his hand on his chest and rubbed it. Mariah said, "Oh no," and Althea heard several gasps from both fairies and werewolves alike. Tristan raised an eyebrow at Braxton. "Do not point your finger at me, young man. I will not be spoken to like a child. I, too, am king of the fairies." "You used your magic against me," Braxton stuttered, shock still radiating from him. "Just like your fairies who began the fray, you're trying to begin one now." Tristan raised his arms in a let's fight gesture. "You say you deserve my respect. Come earn it." Althea grabbed her mother's arm. "Did father just challenge the werewolf king?" Mariah shook her head. "Men. Why does everything have to be a fight?" "Are you challenging me, sir?" Braxton asked skeptically. "If you're willing," Tristan replied haughtily. Blake stepped forward. "Gentlemen, if I may?" "I'm Blake, Braxton's chief advisor," he introduced himself to Tristan. "I don't think a fight between the kings would be the best idea at this time. Your king has not earned the respect he requires." "He has not fought in a battle," Tristan said loudly, his voice carrying to the fairies and werewolves present. "Inciting my people to find fault with my honor is not a route you should pursue, Tristan," Braxton threatened, his voice nothing but a growl. Tristan smiled. "Your honor is already in question, Braxton." "And what battle have you fought in, king?" Braxton asked, his emphasis on the word king not at all kind. "Several, young man, with the scars to prove every one," Tristan bragged. Braxton laughed. "All right. Shall we establish a few ground rules?" "Rules?" "Just you and me," Braxton said with a smile. "Agreed." Tristan also smiled, a slightly feral smile. Althea murmured to her mother, "I don't like that look on father's face. I don't like the gleam in his eye." "He has a plan," Mariah replied, frowning. "Should we go down there?" Althea asked, concern lacing her tone. "Not yet," Mariah told her, putting a hand on her arm to calm her. "Your father has his reasons for this. Let's see what happens. I'll step in should the need arise." "Step in? Between two men?" Althea asked, shocked. Mariah chuckled and shook her head. "No, dear. I'll step in magically." The women returned their attention to the kings, awaiting a fight that was both necessary and unnecessary. Althea, her eyes wide, felt a thrill of excitement accompanied by fear. She'd never seen her father fight, though she'd heard stories. She clasped her hands in front of her as she heard the roar of Braxton as he shifted. She gasped when her father's body became that of a lion, his magic making the fight a little more equal. Gleefully and fearfully, her eyes remained glued on the pair of creatures circling below. Chapter 3. The crowd around the pair of kings had grown. Fairies, who had been watching safely from the other side of the river, flew across for a closer view of what proved to be a very entertaining fight. The werewolves also gathered around, and each kind cheered on his king. The cacophony of noise rose to a level that was almost painful to Althea's ears. The screams of the spectators and the growls and howls of the opponents were deafening. She cringed when the werewolf took the first swipe, though her father's lion reflexes saved him from a nasty injury just in time. The pair circled each other, her father roaring his anger while the werewolf barked in return. After 2 complete circles, the lion seemed to lose patience with the tiptoeing around and leapt at the werewolf, tackling him to the ground. Cheers from the fairies escalated as their king pinned the werewolf with his great paws and snapped at his throat. The werewolf held him at bay with his own powerful paws, snarling. After a few seconds, the werewolf managed to dislodge the lion from his place on top of him, throwing him to the side and launching himself to his feet. Before the lion could prepare, the werewolf jumped on him, and a wrestling match in the dirt ensued. The dust clouds prevented anyone from seeing much, and when they rose together out of the dirt, both were bloody, though none of the injuries were deadly or even that concerning. They began their circling of each other again. Althea frowned. The fight, which had already lasted the better part of 5 minutes, was not escalating past snarls, barks, and a few swipes of the claws. "Mother, they aren't really hurting each other." She glanced at her mother, whose eyes were narrowed as she watched the pair. "Yes. It's almost as if they planned this show of manliness for show," Mariah mused, but she shook her head. "But I know your father hasn't spoken to the werewolf king before we came here today." "Are you sure? Maybe he spoke with him secretly, through secret messengers or something." Althea's was speaking to her mother, but her eyes had returned to the pair. The lion slapped the werewolf's chest, drawing blood. The werewolf howled and jumped on the lion, dragging his claws down the lion's flank, adding to the list of injuries for both. Mariah stood. "This is absurd. Neither are trying to hurt the other, but pain causes anger, and anger becomes fury. And then we'll have a real fight on our hands." She looked at Althea. "Stay here. Do not come down there. When you see your father and I leave, fly to the other side of the river and meet us there." Althea nodded. Her mother, unlike her father, covered loopholes when telling her what to do. So she waited in the tree as her mother flew down into the crowd and magically grew to the height of a human woman. Mariah waited for a break in the fight when the two separated and left a space between them. At the right moment, she stepped out of the crowd when a separation of about 5 feet occurred. Just as the two were about to attack again, she threw up her arm, creating an invisible divider between the two. Both lion and werewolf slammed into the barrier and fell backwards onto the ground. The lion shook his head to clear it, and the werewolf looked around, confused. Both looked at the lovely woman between them. "Enough of this." Mariah's voice held the authority of a queen. "Nothing is being solved with your petty little battle. You are not behaving as kings, but as little boys who want to play with the same toy." The lion and the werewolf looked duly chastised. Tristan returned to his fairy form. "You are right, my dear. This isn't solving anything." He looked at Braxton as he too shifted into human form. "Braxton, I apologize. This is not the way to handle our disagreements." Surprised by the quick apology, Braxton nodded his head. "I'm sorry, too. We should know better. Your wife should not have to chastise us like we're children." Braxton wiped his face with his hand, wincing as the marks on his chest pulled. "Madam, I am sorry." Mariah smiled at him. "Please, King Braxton. Men are men." Her simple explanation elicited nods from the women, fairy and werewolf alike, in the crowd. One even called out, "Here, Here, my lady. Several in the crowd laughed. Braxton and Tristan looked at each other, then stepped forward and shook hands. Tristan said, I think we should tend to our wounds separately, let our tempers and our egos cool, and speak in the morning. I agree, Tristan. Please accept my apology for my behavior, Braxton repeated. The same, sir, Tristan replied. Would 9 be early enough for you? 9 is perfect, Braxton replied. He glanced over the river. Do you and your wife have somewhere to stay? Other than tents, I mean. According to my wife, there is a lovely inn just beyond those trees. We'll stay there. Have a good evening then, Braxton said with a bow of his head. Good evening, Tristan replied, returning the bow. Braxton watched as the queen took her husband's hand and halted him. The couple looked into each other's eyes, and Braxton wondered if they were speaking telepathically to each other. He had no idea if the fairies could do that. The queen looked at him. King, I have the ability to heal your wounds, if you'd like. I'll be healing my husband's. It's only fair that I offer. Braxton smiled at her. Madam, thank you, but I will shift into wolf form again and will be healed by morning. A couple of the werewolves gasped. He'd revealed a secret they thought the fairies were unaware of. Braxton shushed them with, the fairies know that little trick of ours, friends. Mariah tittered. Yes, we've known about that for centuries. Queen Mariah, your kindness is exactly what we need to end all this nonsense, Braxton said. He looked at Tristan. You're a very lucky man to have such a wife. Tristan smiled at him. Thank you. She's my rock, I'll admit. He turned to his wife. Let's go. Goodbye, Braxton, Mariah called as she and her husband shrank and flew across the river. When they were out of earshot, Tristan asked, Where is Althea? She was with me in the trees behind the clearing. We watched the fight. Were the two of you trying not to hurt each other badly? It looked like you were just putting on a show for your peoples. What gave you that idea? He asked as they landed gingerly in front of the inn. Althea rushed to them. Father, are you all right? I will be once your mother heals these cuts, Tristan grunted. Let's go inside. Mariah let Althea lead her father inside. A smirk appeared on her face. Tristan had avoided her question about the fight being just a show, which told her she was right in her assumption. She recalled the conversation they had shared with Braxton and his comment about Tristan being a lucky man to have such a wife. An idea was forming in her head. Mariah! Tristan bellowed from the doorway when he realized she wasn't behind them. She hurried to follow them inside, the smirk still on her lips. Mariah healed his wounds quickly and deftly, her healer's magic powerful. She had a bath drawn for her husband, and he was now relaxed in it, reveling in the warmth of the water and the good wine they had brought with them. Althea had gone to her own room, so Mariah chose this point to speak to her husband about the plan she thought might end this feud. Tristan, I have a thought, Mariah began as she ran a cloth over his chest, the sprinkling of hair there gray with age, though the muscles were still hard. You have many thoughts, Mariah. I imagine this thought is about the controversy we find ourselves dealing with, Tristan replied, his eyes closed. Mariah smiled, he knew her well. Yes. I believe I have a solution. Tristan's eyes opened and his brows rose. Oh, really? Yes. Although it would require agreement from parties we do not have control over, Mariah warned him. Tristan frowned. He sat up, sloshing water on the floor. I don't understand. A marriage between Althea and Braxton, she explained quietly. His eyes widened. What? Are you out of your mind? Lower your voice, please. These walls are thin, Mariah reminded him. Marriage? Althea will balk at the idea. And from my understanding, Braxton isn't too keen on the idea of marriage either. And especially to each other. Mariah nodded. I agree. However, with the union, the fairies and werewolves would be united. United? Tristan blustered, but as he allowed the idea to bang around inside his head, he saw the intelligence behind the suggestion. I know our daughter will fight us, but she understands how the world works. An arranged marriage has always been in her future. She assumes she'll have some say in it, I'm sure, and though I hate to take that away from her, this truly is our best option to end this feud, Mariah concluded. An agreement would have to be made about his treatment of her, Tristan said, capitulating to his wife's plan with no further argument. Of course! But I think we need be more concerned about her treatment of him, if we're being honest, Mariah grinned. That poor man, Tristan agreed. We'll have to discuss the land issues. Our people really are too crowded. We can add that as part of the agreement. Mariah frowned. We'll be trading our daughter for some land, that maybe this is a bad idea. Althea will see it that way, you're right. Tristan's brows furrowed. But our daughter is nothing if not a champion for the people. She'll see the good in this plan. Yes. Eventually, Tristan agreed. He stood in the bathtub and reached for a towel. As he dried his body, he said, Let's work out the details tonight so we can make the proposal to him tomorrow. Send a messenger to his camp asking him to join us for breakfast here at the inn. So we're going to ask Braxton first, I suppose, Mariah asked as she stood and headed for the door. I think that's best, don't you? Mariah thought about it for a moment, then nodded. Yes. If the king agrees with the proposal, Althea will fall in line. Even if she hates us for a while, she finished sadly. Wrapped in the towel, Tristan put his arms around his wife. She won't hate us, Mariah. She'll be angry, but eventually, she'll see it's the only way to end this. Yes. Eventually. Mariah kissed her husband on the lips and left in search of a servant. The next morning, Mariah oversaw the breakfast preparations, chatting merrily with the cook, who owned the inn with her husband. With a touch of magic and a lot of elbow grease, the two women created a breakfast fit for kings, pancakes with 2 different types of syrup, 3 different types of eggs, potatoes, bacon, sausage, and some fruit and milk to balance out the meal. Althea had come down while they were cooking. Good morning, Mother. What's with all the food? Braxton and his advisor are coming here for breakfast so this can be sorted out, Mariah had answered. And you have been invited by some of my relatives to visit their home for the day. Althea lifted an eyebrow. Are you getting rid of me? Yes. I'm sorry I didn't hide that very well, Mariah answered with a sly grin. The cook chuckled, and Althea looked at her, then back at her mother. What's going on? Nothing, dear. Your nosy nose doesn't need to be poking into the meeting today, so I've arranged for you to spend time with people your own age. You've never been to this part of the kingdom. It's quite lovely, Mariah told her. Althea stared at her mother, irritation bubbling up in her and trying to force its way out of her mouth. She swallowed it and said, Fine. I'll spend time with relatives. Are you going to tell me what happens? Of course. I always fill you in. Then why can't I be here during the meeting if you're just going to tell me? Althea asked, her voice a little whiny. She hated being left out. Because. Mariah looked at her daughter. Have fun with your cousins. Althea accepted the dismissal with little grace. Mother, this is just ridiculous. I'm an adult. You and Father have been telling me kingdom business since I was 15. I thought you were grooming me to become queen. Mariah laughed and tapped her daughter's cheek gently with her palm. And as a future queen, you must learn to accept certain things you can't control. Althea rolled her eyes. Fine. I'll see you this afternoon. She turned and walked out of the kitchen without saying goodbye. Mariah sighed. She's a fireball, the cook said to her. Yes, she is. She'll make a fine queen. Sooner than she thinks. Braxton and Blake arrived just as Althea stomped out of the inn followed by 2 other fairies. She lifted into the air, her lovely blonde hair flying behind her. He watched her longer than he should have, considering the comely fairy was so small. But her loveliness had captured his attention. Were she his size, she would be the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Do you know who she is? Braxton asked Blake, who knew everyone, it seemed. Blake glanced up from the papers he held in his hands, following the trail of the 3 fairies. Which one? The one in the lead. I didn't see her face. Sorry. Why do you ask? Curiosity. Braxton turned his eyes and caught Blake staring at him. What? Do not seduce a fairy, Blake warned. Braxton laughed. You know me well. She's awfully pretty. And not for you, Blake replied dryly. Braxton chuckled as they stepped inside the inn. Yes, sir. The inn was werewolf-sized rather than fairy-sized, which Braxton found odd. The fairies present remained in fairy size except the king, queen, and who Braxton assumed were the owners. A table was laid out with a buffet that had enough food for 10 people, not the 4 who would be eating. Braxton's stomach growled in appreciation as Tristan and Mariah stepped forward to greet him and Blake. Good morning, Braxton, Tristan said, his hand extended for a shake. And Blake. Hello, Tristan, Mariah, Braxton answered. He shook Tristan's hand and placed a kiss on Mariah's knuckles. Such a charmer, Mariah giggled, blushing. How about we make our plates and get comfortable? Then we can discuss our business with full bellies. All agreed and filled their plates. They discussed banalities while they ate, enjoying each other's company and getting to know each other. As Mariah laughed at one of Braxton's jokes, she was more convinced that the marriage between her daughter and this young man was the answer they were looking for. Althea would grow to like him and, Mariah thought, based on Braxton's personality, she might even come to love him. Eventually. Tristan sat back, rubbing his full belly. So, Braxton, let's get to business, if you're ready? Yes, of course, Braxton replied, wiping his mouth with a napkin. I assume you have an idea of some sort? You assume correctly, Tristan said with a smile. Now, my wife and I thought this plan up last night, so there might still be a few holes here and there, but the 4 of us can hash those out this morning. Tristan cleared his throat and looked at Mariah, who smiled beautifully, sure their idea was a good one. Mariah and I would like to propose a marriage. Braxton chalked, then laughed. I'm sorry. I don't believe in bigamy. Mariah laughed with him. Neither do we, young man. Mariah and I have a daughter who is your age, as I'm sure you're aware, Tristan continued. We are proposing a marriage between our kingdoms. You and our daughter. Braxton leaned back in his chair, astonished. He had known what they meant the first time, but he had hoped a joke would diffuse his shock and give him time to think about how in the hell he was going to refuse this proposal without insulting them. Blake spoke before he had the chance. And what would you want in return for this marriage? Tristan spread his hands. Honestly, if our kingdoms are combined by this marriage, I would like for our people to merge as well. I know this will be difficult at first, but if we share all the land in the fairy kingdom and the werewolf kingdom, the fairies would be able to live in more spacious areas. Blake nodded, focusing on all the ramifications that could come from this marriage. Mostly positive outcomes were all he could come up with. He looked at Braxton, who had paled while listening to the proposal. Blake was well aware of Braxton's aversion to marriage, but this idea had all the merits of a workable plan. Yes, the werewolves and the fairies would have some adjusting to do, but after a while, he felt both groups would agree this was the best idea. Braxton, I think this is a proposal worth thinking about, Blake said, letting Braxton know he thought he should agree while also giving him the opportunity to refuse. He hoped he didn't. Braxton stared at him, appalled, though his face was carefully blank. But Blake knew his feelings based on the subtle clenching and unclenching of his jaw. He returned his attention to the king and queen. I'm not sure about this marriage idea. No disrespect meant, but certainly there are other ideas we can toss around. Tristan and Mariah exchanged a glance. Braxton, my wife and I stayed up late. Believe me, we've thought of every possible way for our peoples to get along. This is the strongest idea. Blake frowned and opened his mouth to agree, but Braxton glared at him before answering Tristan. Tristan, I've never planned on marrying at all, much less marrying someone who isn't a werewolf. Again, no disrespect, but this isn't something I want. Mariah smiled at him. No man ever dreams of marriage. But as a king, you have a responsibility to your people. Who would be your heir if you never married nor had children? Braxton's frown deepened. He hated to admit it, but he'd never given that a moment's thought. Well, my sister has children, as will my brother one day, I'm sure. I could choose from them. You could. But it's not the same as handing your throne to your own child, Tristan told him. If you married my daughter, the two of you would be king and queen of 2 kingdoms. I thought we would combine them into one, Braxton reminded him. Tristan winked. That's the idea. Your child or children with my daughter would then be in line for the throne. How do you know we can even have children? Braxton asked. Mariah chuckled. On the outskirts of our kingdom, far in the south, there is a village comprised of fairies and werewolves who have lived together for decades. In peace. They have mixed children running around. Very interesting place. Tristan was staring at his wife. I know nothing of this area. Blake said, I've never heard of it either. Because it's never been a cause for concern, Mariah replied. That village proves, without a doubt, that werewolves and fairies can live together if they chose to. This marriage will bring about a peace neither kingdom has seen in some time. Braxton stared at Mariah, as did her husband and Blake. More than well-informed, the woman was a brilliant politician, although one would never know it. Is your daughter like you? Braxton asked. I do hope you're being complimentary, Mariah said dryly. Braxton chuckled. Yes, madam. You are a formidable adversary. You seem to have all the answers. Tristan took his wife's hand and kissed her knuckles. That is why I trust her judgment above anyone else's. Braxton admired their relationship. He let the silence stretch for a moment as he debated with himself. Was this the only option? Was there a way for him to change the hatred in his kingdom, to end the fights, without getting married? Blake wanted him to do this, he could tell, and he had no other options. Can I make this sacrifice for my kingdom? For my people, he wondered. He stood up and paced. I need a moment to think, please. The three watched him as he paced for 5 minutes, remaining silent so he could dig down deep in his heart and find the answer that was right for him. More importantly, the right answer for his people. And the right answer was marriage to a fairy princess who was probably spoiled and awful. He let his head fall and stared at the ground, his hands on his hips. When he lifted his head, his determination showed clearly in his eyes. I guess we need to plan a wedding. Chapter 4. Althea had enjoyed her day with her cousins much more than she'd expected. She hadn't forgotten the dismissal from her mother, but affairs of the state were usually boring. Her cousins had taken her to an adorable little tavern with the best fairy drinks she'd had outside of the castle. Her cousins had been delightful, fun, and told intriguing stories about life close to the werewolves. When she returned to the inn where her family was staying, she found her mother and father in the bar area waiting for her to get back. She smiled when she walked in. "How was your meeting?" she asked politely. Mariah rolled her eyes. "Quit pretending." "Pretending?" Althea asked innocently. Her father chuckled. "I'm sorry we didn't let you sit in on the meeting with the werewolf king. But we do intend to tell you every detail," Mariah told her. Althea frowned. Her parents rarely shared with her unless it directly involved her or something she was interested in. A meeting with the werewolf king had absolutely nothing to do with her. As far as she knew. She narrowed her eyes at her mother, then her father. "What's going on?" "You two are acting strangely," Althea murmured quietly. "How about a hint?" Tristan teased. "A hint?" Althea's voice rose a decibel. Her mother arched her eyebrow at her, and she lowered her voice again, reaching for the calm. "Why don't you just tell me?" Mariah smiled at her husband, who had looked at her and nodded. She waved her hand in the air next to her and murmured a few fairy words. A dress materialized next to her, white and lovely, and Althea gasped. "What in the gods' trees is that?" Althea asked, pointing at the dress as if it were a violent, 5-headed creature waiting to eat her bone marrow. Tristan laughed again. "What does it look like, dear?" "It looks like a wedding dress," Althea said through clenched teeth. "And it better not be for anyone in this room." Mariah placed a hand on her arm, but Althea pulled it away. "What is going on?" "Althea, you need to calm down." "We'll talk about this calmly," Tristan placated. "Talk about what?" "Tell me what is going on." Althea's insistence irritated him. "You are much too much like me," Tristan mused as he exchanged another glance with Mariah. This would be more difficult than he had anticipated. "Mariah, I think it's your turn." Mariah tilted her head at him and pursed her lips. Althea knew that look. Mariah's irritation with her husband was plain on her face. Briefly, she closed her eyes to find her calm, then turned to Althea. "Althea, your father and I have made a wonderful arrangement for you." Althea arched her eyebrows similarly to her mother's. "Arrangement?" Mariah sighed. "Althea, why are you pretending to be dense?" She gestured to the wedding dress and waited for the expected explosion. But none came. Mariah looked at her husband, who stared at his daughter with something like trepidation in his eyes. Althea had come to the conclusion of a marriage between herself and the werewolf king the moment she'd seen the wedding dress pop out of thin air. However, she'd hoped her conclusion was wrong. When her suspicions had been proven, she'd frozen, inside and out. She had no reaction because her mind wasn't functioning properly. She stared to her left, away from the dress, so she couldn't even see it in her peripheral vision. After several minutes of unbroken silence, Mariah sat forward and touched her daughter's hand. "Althea," she asked quietly. "You expect me to marry the werewolf king?" Her voice was too calm, too even. Your father and I agreed that a marriage between the two of you will bring the two kingdoms together. When did you decide this was the best course of action? Mariah looked at Tristan, who took over. Last night. And you made this decision without consulting me? We did, Tristan said, his voice strong in the face of her absence of emotion. What if I refuse? Althea asked, finally making eye contact with her father. Mariah sighed. Althea, you are not in the position to refuse. The position? As in I have no choice? Althea's emotions were beginning to loosen. Tristan bristled at her tone. You are first and foremost the fairy princess. You've always known you have a duty to this kingdom. It is now time you fulfilled that duty. Althea leapt out of her seat and slammed her hands down on the table, her emotions boiling over. Duty? Duty? Are you kidding me? She pointed at her mother. You weren't forced into an arranged marriage. You chose your husband. And you're asking me to do my duty to the kingdom? This is outrageous. Mariah remained calm. She had known the brunt of Althea's anger would fall on her rather than Tristan. You are right, Althea. I chose my husband, and he chose me. But I was a commoner who enjoyed the privilege of choice. You are not. Althea stared at her mother in disbelief. A commoner? Your father was the right-hand man to his. You grew up in the castle just like I did. Don't call yourself a commoner and expect me to agree to this ridiculous arrangement without batting an eye. Mariah rose as well. On eye level with her daughter, she said, I understand you're angry, but may I reiterate that you are my daughter. Your level of disrespect will not be tolerated. Tristan watched as his wife and daughter faced off. He understood his daughter's anger, but, much to his displeasure, his daughter did not have a choice. However, his interference at this point in the argument would not be helpful. He waited. Mother, I am not being disrespectful to you, but to this absurd plan. This man you are asking me to marry is a barbarian. He's a werewolf. He attacked father. Althea gestured to her father. You watched that fight just like I did, Althea. Don't romanticize your father's involvement by pretending Braxton attacked first. They agreed to that little skirmish, and you know it. Althea narrowed her eyes. He's a beast. I will not marry him. Mariah pointed at her, her calm dissolved completely with her daughter's refusal. Young lady, you will marry him. If I have to bind your arms and legs, you will be at that ceremony tomorrow, and you will say I do. Tomorrow! Althea's eyes widened. I'm supposed to marry that man tomorrow? You are marrying that man tomorrow. Mariah's tone ended the argument. Althea looked at her father for help. Tristan lifted his hands, palms up. The decision has been made. Althea refused to cry as her mother flitted about tailoring her own wedding dress to fit her daughter while in human size. Her fury went beyond tears. She vibrated with it, her body taut with tension as her mother worked. Occasionally, Althea would ignore her mother's request to lift her arms or hold her head up. Her mother had resorted to magic to forcefully hold her arms up until Althea had agreed to do as requested when requested. She hadn't spoken since her father had essentially laid down the law. The next morning, she would be marrying the werewolf king, and there was nothing she could do about it. But she wouldn't be pleasant about it. She rejected every effort her mother made to draw her into the excitement of the beautiful dress. The sleeveless dress was an iridescent shade of white that fit snugly against her torso before blossoming like a flower at her waist, falling to the floor in thin layers. The bodice and hem had been trimmed in her mother's favorite color of lace, cerulean, and her mother had inquired about her favorite color. Grudgingly, Althea had revealed that she preferred the green color of holly leaves, a similar shade to her eyes, and as she watched, her mother had transformed the trim. Althea would not tell her mother how beautiful the dress looked on her, but to herself, she admitted the truth. She loved the way the dress hugged her curves without being tacky, and the green was perfect. After an hour of near silence, Althea asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "And where exactly is the happy occasion to take place?" Mariah had started at her daughter's voice. Right outside near the stream. Our family and friends are decorating the area right now. And I suppose there will be a dinner? Yes. At the tavern in the werewolf village. How elegant, Althea replied blandly. I suppose they'll be serving raw meat and tankards of beer. Such a beautiful reception. Mariah rose and faced her daughter, her expression filled with anger. She pointed a finger at Althea. You will mind your tongue, young lady, and be grateful you aren't marrying some ogre. You don't know I'm not marrying an ogre in a pretty package, Althea retorted. Wasn't yesterday the first time you've laid eyes on him, let alone spoken to him? You know nothing about him. I know he is the king of the werewolves, Mariah answered. And I know that his people love him. And there are many weeping werewolf females around the kingdom who were hoping he would choose one of them when he was ready to choose. Let him choose one of them then, Althea said. Just because he's a wonderful public figure doesn't mean he's as good behind closed doors. And you're sending me to him as if I'm something to sell. What if he beats me? Or forces me to do disgusting things? I would know if he was a deviant, Althea. Althea halted the tirade ready to explode out of her mouth and considered. Are you saying you have spies in the werewolf castle? Mariah sniffed. I do not have spies anywhere, dear. I just know things. Althea didn't know which was true, if her mother had spies or if she really was a clairvoyant, but either way, her mother's information had never been wrong. Her mother took her hand. Althea, I know this isn't what you dreamed of for your wedding. But as a member of the royal family, you must make sacrifices for the kingdom. This is yours. Althea's head drooped. Mother, I'm sacrificing my entire life. Possibly my happiness. To ask this of me is to ask for everything. I know, love, but I can't change it. Braxton is a good man who will treat you well. Don't go into this with bitterness in your heart. You'll grow old before your time. What am I supposed to feel, Mother? Althea pleaded. Mariah sighed. The man is kind. It's clear in his eyes. She bumped Althea's shoulder with her own as she walked around her, surveying the dress one more time before she let her remove it. And he's certainly not hard on the eyes. Althea giggled but sobered quickly. That is true. But what if I'm not happy? What if we can't get along? You'll have to find a way, my dear, Mariah told her. Let's get you out of the dress. You'll want to take a long, hot bath with a glass of wine for company. You'll be less nervous that way tomorrow morning. Althea stared at her mother. Her anxiety, her fears, nor her anger would be diminished by a hot bath and a glass of wine. She'd need a much more powerful antidote for those things, such as a reversal of the decision. Which wouldn't happen. She sighed despairingly as her mother helped her out of the dress, and she resigned herself to her fate. She would marry a man she didn't love, a man she didn't even know, and she would have to live with it for the rest of her life. I have to live with this woman for the rest of my life. Braxton growled into his mug of beer, his spirits low. I know I agreed in the moment, but now that I've had time to think, I'm wondering if this isn't a huge mistake. Blake had been listening to his best friend moan over the decision for the last hour without saying much. Really, the man had repeated himself again and again. He jumped when Braxton slammed his palm on the table to emphasize his next point. I haven't even seen what she looks like. She could be a hippo with teeth to match for all I know. Braxton shook his head, despair warring with drunkenness. Blake chuckled. I've heard she's lovely, Braxton. As I told you 20 minutes ago when you brought it up for the second time. So this is time number 3. Braxton glared at him and pointed a finger accusingly at him. This is really your fault, you know. Why is that? Blake asked, although his already knew the answer. You pushed me into this marriage, Braxton grumbled before taking another swig from his nearly empty 4th tankard of beer. You know this is the best way to end the nonsense between the werewolves and fairies, Blake reminded him again. Braxton put his forehead on the table in defeat. I know. And I know it's not your fault. He sat up suddenly, and Blake put his hand out and caught the tankard before it tipped over. But I've never wanted to get married. To anyone. And especially not to a woman I've never met. You never had that choice, Braxton, and you know it, Blake told him. He put the tankard on the table next to them and gestured the owner away as he carried another full glass for Braxton. Eventually, an heir would have been necessary. An heir? That's another issue, Braxton said. What kind of child will she and I be able to produce? Half werewolf, half fairy? What will it look like? What skills will it possess? There's really only one way to learn, and that's to travel, after the wedding, to the village Mariah told us about, Blake suggested. Braxton seemed to like that idea. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That might actually be fun for both of us. We'll need to make appearances all over the kingdom to improve morale anyway. Exactly, Blake agreed, hoping his friend would find the positive in this marriage. After several minutes of silence, Braxton asked, What time am I getting married? 10 tomorrow morning, Blake answered. What am I wearing? Mariah made a tux for you. Braxton's eyes shot up. How does she know my size? Blake shrugged. She's a fairy, and no ordinary fairy. She seems to know everything. Braxton mused on that a moment. I've noticed she's curiously well informed. She'll be a useful mother-in-law. I agree, Blake said, noting the slurred words at the end of his sentence. Let's be off to bed then. You need your beauty rest. Braxton rose a little unsteadily. Yes. Must look my best for my bride. They stumbled to the rooms, and Blake let Braxton fall onto the bed fully clothed. Mariah walked down to the stream dressed in her best attire. Her husband had assured her everything was prepared, but she had to see for herself. She hadn't been involved in the actual decorating, but Althea's best friend, Kala, had arrived early that morning to oversee everything. Mariah searched for her among the flittering fairies and wandering werewolves. When she saw her, she called, Kala. The lovely fairy turned and waved. Hello, Mariah. How do you like it? It's perfect. Althea will love it, Mariah smiled. I certainly hope so, Kala mused quietly, looking around. She had visited with her friend before decorating commenced. Althea was not at all happy about this marriage, so Kala had put an extra effort to please her in this area. I was about to go back and make sure she doesn't need anything. Mariah waved her hand. The only thing she needs is a new attitude about all this. Althea and Mariah had had another argument that morning, this one more explosive than any of the others. Mariah was afraid her daughter would not speak to either her or Tristan for some time after this wedding took place. Kala put a hand on her shoulder. She'd heard the yelling, she'd heard Tristan interrupt and end the argument. I know she's angry now, and I'll admit, I don't blame her, but she'll come around. Mariah arched an eyebrow at her. Thank you for your honesty. Of course, Kala said, a smile on her face. Movement caught her eye. Oh wow. Is that the werewolf king? Mariah turned. Braxton and Blake had walked in together, and the king looked drool-worthy. Yes, the one on the left. Gods, he's handsome. She doesn't have much to complain about, does she? Kala said quietly, gazing at the handsome werewolf. Those big shoulders alone could make a girl swoon. Mariah laughed. He is a bit of eye candy. Althea does admit to that. Good morning, Mariah, Braxton greeted, smiling at the women. And you are? I'm Kala, Althea's best friend. Kala introduced herself with a smile. She turned her eyes on Blake. Blake. I'm Braxton's best friend. We'll have a lot to talk about, I'm sure, Kala told him, and they shared a chuckle. I have to go inside and help Althea. We'll be starting in 10 minutes. Braxton nodded and looked around at the area. Kala had done a wonderful job, an arch decorated with vines, flowers, and fairies as small as lightning bugs lighting up in all sorts of colors. The aisle was lined with leaves, and against the edges Kala had conjured several lilies in various colors. Chairs were filled on one side with werewolves dressed in mostly earth tones, browns, grays, greens, and blacks. Most of the werewolves had come out in their best attire, while others were a little on the shabby side, wearing clothes they didn't mind shifting in. On the other side were the fairies, who were all dressed in their finest and brightest clothes. Every color in the rainbow was represented in their attire or their hair. The contrast was almost headache-inducing, but Braxton liked that the two groups were interacting peacefully. He moved to the arch and smiled at the glittering fairies and the Gorgon who waited to conduct the ceremony. Good morning, Theno. Thank you for coming on such short notice. We Gorgons enjoy weddings so much. I thank you for allowing me to perform this lovely ceremony. The Gorgon spoke and moved slowly. Their impartiality was infamous, they held no opinion on the behavior of any species other than their own. Humans were the only group who had anything to fear from the Gorgons, only they would be turned to stone when they looked at one of them. Braxton smiled at her. It's definitely going to be the wedding of the century, he joked. You jest, but this wedding is the first of its kind. The creatures of this world are happy about this union and believe this will end hostilities between your people and hers. I agree. Braxton looked at her. The Gorgons made him uneasy, they had a knack for knowing things before it was possible to know them. He smiled without speaking and turned to watch his future bride float down the aisle on iridescent wings. His eyes widened as her face came into view. Stunningly beautiful, her green eyes practically glowed as she watched him as she floated closer to him. He could not determine the length of her brown hair, it was in an intricate updo and topped with a tiara of leaves. Her face was heart-shaped and lovelier than any face he'd ever seen. Her skin shone like the sun, and Braxton wondered if she or her mother had used magic to make her appear so. Flawless, he thought, smiling at her to ease the obvious discomfort she felt. Althea smiled back, mesmerized by the transformation of his face. When she'd first stepped out, the frown marring that handsome face had been frightening, almost menacing, the werewolf close to the surface. Fear had leapt into her heart until he had smiled at her. She hated to admit it, but the man was more handsome than any other she'd ever seen. Of course, she thought, I won't tell him that. Good morning, Theno. I'm happy to see you, Althea replied sweetly. She had known the Gorgon her whole life and had always liked her. Happy to see me. Not happy to marry, Theno pronounced quietly so only Althea and Braxton could hear her. Neither of you are. But don't worry, handsome Braxton and lovely Althea, you will find your happiness in each other. Eventually. Althea and Braxton exchanged a glance. Her premonition sounded nice, until she added eventually. A scary word, the pair thought together. Chapter 5. Mariah was a born diplomat, and with the help of several fairies and werewolves, she had managed to pull together a dinner that would satisfy any creature who had come for the wedding. Of course, fairies and werewolves had been in attendance, as well as the Gorgon Theno and one of her sisters, some elves from a neighboring kingdom, a kingdom which were allies to both the fairies and the werewolves, and a handful of centaurs, who had always remained neutral. The food, it had been agreed upon, had been provided mostly by the fairies, and the werewolves had supplied the beverages, alcoholic and non-alcoholic. Several tables had been magicked by the fairies to the clearing where they had chosen to hold the reception and were laden with so much food and drink an army could have eaten for days. More tables were tastefully decorated with flowers and vines that grew in the area. Mariah walked around, making last-minute adjustments here and there to make sure it was perfect for her daughter. She had watched her new son-in-law's face when Althea had stepped out and walked down the aisle. He might not love her now, but he was certainly attracted to her. She hadn't been able to see Althea's face, but something Theno had said had shocked the couple. They'd frozen, looked at each other, then at Theno. She stepped over to Theno. You performed a lovely ceremony, Theno. Thank you. You are most welcome. What is truly on your mind, Mariah? Theno asked as she watched the guests file in and select seats while they waited for the happy couple to arrive. Mariah chuckled and looked down. What did you say to Althea and Braxton before you began the ceremony? Theno's slow smile altered her face, her haggard appearance became more comely, though not quite lovely. I told them the truth. Mariah sighed. Asking Theno what she'd said had been a lost cause, but she'd had to try. Maybe Althea would tell her. The curiosity would drive her mad. She excused herself and walked to the table where a group of fairies were decorating the cake, a lovely combination of earth tones and sunset colors to represent both Althea's heritage and Braxton's. Beautiful work, ladies, Mariah complimented. She turned to survey the growing crowd, pleased that the fairies, werewolves, and other creatures seemed to be mingling rather than keeping to their own kind. With Kala's help, Althea shed the wedding gown for a more comfortable dress. She'd chosen a bright pink dress with a diaphanous layer of white tulle over it. Her eyes kept drifting to the gold band with vines engraved into it on her left ring finger. She was silent, lost in her thoughts, and Kala did not interrupt her musings. When Althea was silent, it was best to leave her alone. Need anything else? Kala asked. No, thank you, Althea murmured in response as she checked her hair in a mirror. Thanks for helping me. Is Braxton coming to retrieve you, or are you meeting him? Kala asked as she finished hanging up the wedding gown she hoped her friend's daughter would wear someday. Retrieve me? Am I his pet? Althea's tone was harsh, ugly. Kala looked at her and waited. Althea dropped her eyes. I'm sorry, that was rude. Yes, but I understand. Kala took her friend's hand between hers. It's a tradition for the bride and groom to walk into the reception together. All species adhere to that one. Althea chuckled mirthlessly. Yeah, that's one thing we have in common. That tradition. I'm sure you'll find more in common the more you get to know him, Kala assured her. It will take time, but I think you'll grow to like him. Oh, really? What makes you think that? Althea asked, her skepticism plain in her voice. Kala shook her head. You're so pessimistic. When did that happen? Althea stared at her best friend blandly, and Kala chuckled. I think you'll like him because he's a decent man. I've heard he's intelligent, and he's so gorgeous I want to lick him. Surprised by her friend's raunchy statement, Althea's laugh exploded out of her. I can't believe you said that about my new husband. Girl, if you don't want to lick him, I'll question your preferences. Kala exclaimed, and the pair doubled over in laughter. A knock sounded on the door. Althea wiped her tears of laughter and answered the door. Braxton stood on the other side holding a gift box exquisitely wrapped in gold paper. His smile vanished when he saw her tears. Is everything all right? He asked, his voice laced with concern. Althea straightened and wiped her cheeks. Her smile had also disappeared. Everything is fine. We were laughing. Kala looked from one to the other, the tension between them so thick she couldn't breathe. Well, I'll just leave you two alone. Braxton smiled at her. I'm Braxton. Kala stopped and smiled back. I'm Kala, Althea's best friend. It's a pleasure to meet you, Braxton replied. He glanced at Althea, who watched the exchange without comment. I look forward to getting to know you. Although the statement was in response to Kala's introduction of herself, he was clearly speaking to Althea. She looked at him, her eyes narrowed a little. She offered him a small smile and nodded. Kala watched the awkward exchange, a small smile on her face as well. Everything will be just fine, she thought to herself. Please excuse me. She walked out of the room and closed the door behind her, hoping the couple would use the opportunity to find a way to ease the tension between them. Braxton and Althea stood in the room, their eyes on anything but each other. Neither of them knew what to say, so neither spoke. They were the oddest married couple. You looked beautiful today, Braxton told her. You still do. Look beautiful, I mean. Althea smiled at him. Thank you. You look handsome, then and now. So, Braxton said. He rocked back on his heels. He remembered the gift in his hand and extended it to her. I asked a friend to bring this from the castle for you. I hope you like it. Althea looked at the box for a moment before taking it. I didn't get you anything. You aren't supposed to get me something. A girl's wedding day is her day. The groom just shows up and does what he's told, he joked. She looked at him but didn't smile. He sighed. I know this isn't what you imagined your wedding would be. Same here. Yes, this isn't what I imagined, but it wasn't awful either, Althea agreed, still holding the present she had yet to unwrap. Braxton chuckled. Not awful. That's a good start. Althea laughed with him. Open your gift. Please. Althea ripped the paper off and let it fall to the floor. She opened the box and gasped. A pendant on a silver chain lay in the box, waiting for her to lift it out and make it hers. The moonstone pendant shone, its blue and pearl colors beautiful, iridescent, and eye-catching. It's lovely, Althea whispered, her fingers brushing across the stone. She lifted it out of the box and set the box on a table close by. She gazed at it, mesmerized. She looked up at Braxton and smiled. How did you know my favorite stone is moonstone? Braxton let a breath out, his relief plain. I didn't know. How fortuitous. Althea looked up at him. Fortuitous? The moonstone is the stone werewolves always wear, Braxton told her. Get it? Moon. Stone. She looked confused for a moment before it dawned on her. Oh. Because you shift during the full moon. Well, that's a myth, Braxton told her with a small laugh. But that's the idea. This one belonged to my mother. Althea gasped. I can't accept this, Braxton. You're my wife, Braxton said, although the word wife came out after a tiny, almost unnoticeable pause. She would want you to have it. Althea had heard the hesitation, but since it matched her own, she was not offended in the least. She looked at the necklace again. The pendant was an oval shape, as long as her pinky and an inch wide. It glinted in the light beautifully. It's really pretty, Althea told him again. Braxton reached for it and asked, May I? Yes, thank you. Althea turned around, presenting her back to Braxton. He reached around to put the necklace on, easily adjusting the clasp. His fingers brushed the back of her neck, causing goose pimples to erupt on her skin. When she finished, he grasped her shoulders and turned her, admiring the necklace as it lay against her skin. Perfect, he murmured. Althea touched the pendant and smiled at Braxton. Thank you, Braxton. I love it. I'm glad. Braxton held his arm out to her. May I escort you in? With a little giggle, she took his arm. I would love that, too. As they walked in, thunderous applause echoed through the forest. Braxton looked down at Althea. I guess we're a hit. The couple took their seats at the head table, her parents, her best friend, and his best friend seated with them. Before food and drinks were served, Tristan made a moving speech about triumphing over the hatred of a century in one day. With this marriage, our two species can finally find peace and harmony. Our children, their children, he pointed at Althea and Braxton, won't have to live in fear of a skirmish or an uprising. These two beautiful people, a werewolf and a fairy, will bring us the accord rather than discord, unity rather than dissidence, and a world we all deserve. Althea and Braxton were the only two who did not share in the revelry. Tristan had spoken of their children, an idea that frightened the two of them more than either would admit. Althea had visibly paled at the mention of children, and Braxton's frown had not left his face since that moment. They had glanced at each other and immediately away, keeping their thoughts to themselves. Dinner was served quickly after Tristan took his seat and was scrumptious, with several different types of cuisine available. Mariah did lean over and point out to Althea that there seemed to be not one scrap of raw meat, to which Althea only grunted that yes, she had noticed. She hated when her mother was right. Beverages were served, and soon many were tipsy and talking loudly and enjoying the party. Althea had only sipped hers. She wanted her wits about her when it was time to go to bed. She feared that hour like it was her death coming, not sex with a handsome man. But her virginity was still intact, she knew very little but the basics about what happened between a man and a woman. So her heart was filled with fear. She watched the dancers as they began their routine, entertainment for the evening, but she could not concentrate on their graceful movements. Braxton, always intuitive, could tell his bride was uneasy, but he had no idea why. He tried to engage her in a conversation, speaking loudly over the music of the performers. My castle is, from what I understand, much like your father's. Except it's werewolf-sized rather than fairy-sized. He chuckled, but it faded when she didn't respond. He tried again. You'll have your own suite of rooms, and if Kala would like to come with you, she is more than welcome, of course. It might make the adjustment easier for you if you have a familiar face around. Althea's head had slowly swiveled until she was looking at him, her eyes wide. Until that moment, she hadn't thought about the fact that she'd be expected to live in the werewolf castle away from her family. In fact, she'd been wishing she was home just before he spoke to her. Werewolf castle? I plan to live in the fairy castle, but thank you, Althea replied haughtily. Excuse me? Braxton as sure he hadn't heard her right. Althea looked at him. I have no intention of leaving my home. You may come to the fairy castle and live there. Braxton continued to stare, at a loss for words. Around them, the revelers enjoyed the dancing and music, but the couple was in their own world. Exactly how am I supposed to live in a fairy-sized castle? Magic, Althea replied as if it was the simplest thing. How do you think I'm maintaining this size? This is not natural to me. Althea, you may have magic to keep your size. I do not, Braxton reminded her, his voice taking on an edge at her stubborn words. You are my wife and we will live in the werewolf castle. You plan to rule over me like one of your subjects? Althea asked, intentionally misunderstanding his words. Braxton took a deep breath. You know that is not what I meant. It is more logical to live in my castle, for one. It's centrally located, and everyone fits inside. Mariah, who was sitting closest to Althea, tapped her husband's shoulder and indicated the pair, whose voices had grown louder. Tristan watched and listened but did not interfere between husband and wife. So am I to understand that you expect me to remain in werewolf size for the rest of my life? Althea asked, bristling. I assumed you would want to. You know, as the queen of this realm and all, Braxton said sarcastically. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to use my magic constantly? I'll be exhausted all the time. Mariah wanted to interrupt, and even opened her mouth to do so. Maintaining werewolf size was ridiculously easy, her daughter was lying. But Tristan placed a hand on her arm to halt her words. Braxton rolled his eyes at her, which infuriated her. You do not have to stay this size all the time. I don't care what you do when we aren't together. That isn't even what this argument is about. Living at the fairy castle isn't an option. Althea's voice was a decibel below a yell and she slammed her hand down on the table, pulling the attention of those closest to them directly to her. I will not live in the werewolf castle. Tristan decided this was the moment to step in. Althea, he hissed, hoping the guests' attention would be drawn back to the entertainers. You are causing a scene. You are not a stupid girl. Common sense should have indicated you'd be moving to the werewolf castle. Now stop this nonsense. Althea stared at her father, then looked back at Braxton. His face was just a little too smug, and her fury reached full potential. She rose to her feet and walked out without speaking to anyone. All eyes followed her, and a lull in the conversations around them told them everyone had heard at least the end of the altercation. Kala leapt up from her seat to follow Althea. I'll speak to her, calm her down. Maybe I can help her see reason. She rushed away on her last words. Tristan shook his head and looked at Braxton, whose eyes had followed his new bride as she stalked out. Braxton, I am sorry for my daughter's behavior. She has always been headstrong. I just assumed she knew she'd be moving away, Mariah murmured. I never once thought there was a need to mention it to her. Braxton nodded. Honestly, I don't blame her for being angry. This marriage was difficult for me to swallow, sure. But I get to go home tomorrow. She doesn't. Tristan and Mariah exchanged a glance. They were thinking the same thing. This man's patience was exactly what their daughter required. The two of them would balance each other, if Althea would allow it. The king and queen clasped hands and hoped for the best. Kala barged into the room without knocking and stood with her hands on her hips, staring at Althea, who was seething and breathing so hard Kala worried she might have a seizure. Althea, expecting sympathy, exploded. Can you believe this? Why in the underworld would I have to move? He can move as easily as I can. Kala only stared at her. Her lips were pressed together, which meant she was either angry, disappointed, or both. She waited for her best friend to say something, but she didn't. Althea also slipped into silence, reflecting on what had transpired. When another few minutes passed in silence, Althea lost her cool. "Damn it, Kala, why aren't you saying anything? Althea, have you lost your mind? I have the right to be angry about this, Kala. Why does my life have to be completely uprooted? I didn't even want this marriage." Kala shook her head, amazed. "Althea, what did you think would happen? You're not stupid." "I'm not stupid. What I am is furious. I didn't want this marriage. I was forced into it and now I have to leave my home? Live among strangers who are nothing like me?" Her voice hitched and a tear slipped out of one eye. "Kala, I don't want to leave my home. I've never lived anywhere else." As she had expected, Althea's outburst was due to fear, not stubbornness or the fit of a spoiled child. But she was afraid Braxton probably thought one of the last two. As Althea succumbed to her sobs, she sank to the floor. Kala moved to her and lowered her body to the floor. "Althea, I know this isn't how you pictured your life, but this has the potential to be wonderful. If you'll let it." Kala paused. She ran her hand over Althea's hair, petting her, soothing her. "What did you think? That Braxton would shrink down to fairy size? He doesn't have that power. But I do. I would have taken care of him, made sure he was comfortable in his new size," Althea claimed. Kala sighed. "Instead, he'll take care of you in your new size. And Braxton has invited me to live there as well, so you won't be alone there." Althea was thoughtful, sniffling a little as she calmed and let rational thought take over. She was being obstinate, ridiculous, but he had handled it badly as well. It made sense that she would move there, of course, but she just hadn't thought about it. She looked at Kala. "I just want to go home, curl up in my bed, and sleep until this isn't my reality anymore." "You can't, though. But truthfully, Althea, I think your life is going to be better than you think. But you're going to have to do something else you don't want to do. You wouldn't do well as a gypsy, Althea." "Too much hard work," Kala teased, pulling a giggle out of Althea, who stood and walked to the mirror. "Well, this isn't pretty," she murmured as she began repairing the damage crying had done to her face. Her eyes were swollen, her makeup ruined, and she still looked pale. "I guess now is as good a time as any. Do you think he's still downstairs?" "Actually, he was leaving as I was. I assume he went to his room." Althea nodded, gathered her strength, and said, "Wish me luck." "Good luck." Althea left the room and made the short trip down the hall to Braxton's room. When she reached it, she heard voices, Braxton's and Blake's, behind the door. Steeling herself for the humbling she was about to endure, she knocked on the door. Blake answered. He smiled at her. "Hello, Althea." Hi. May I speak to Braxton alone, please?" "Of course," he answered. He stepped past her into the hallway and leaned over to whisper, "He's angry, but he's forgiving. And he also knows he handled it badly. I hope the two of you go easy on each other." Althea smiled at him and watched him walk away. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The room was similar to hers, not elegant but comfortable. Braxton stood in front of the fireplace, watching her as she walked in. Althea moved to the middle of the room and halted. She looked at the floor, then forced herself to make eye contact. "I'm sorry for my behavior. I hadn't thought past this day. The fact that I have to leave my home, my family, and all my friends weighs heavily on me." Again her voice hitched, and she paused to collect herself. I should not have made a scene, and I'm sorry. Braxton's respect for his wife grew. However, she had to learn a lesson today, or this kind of behavior would continue. Thank you for your apology. His answer was cold. Althea pressed her lips together to refrain from making a comment that would have started a fight. You're welcome. The submissive behavior went against everything in her nature, but she had been in the wrong and knew it. I'll leave you then. Be ready to leave by sunrise, Braxton commanded. He watched as she froze and turned slowly to look at him. Tomorrow? He nodded. How am I supposed to get the rest of my things? Your mother and I have already handled the delivery of your things. Everything will be there a couple of days after we arrive, Braxton told her. Her spine straightened and anger flashed in her eyes again. I do not like things being handled for me. You're the queen now. Small things like your luggage will always be handled for you. Small things, she screeched. You're talking about packing my whole life. Braxton's hard look wavered briefly. He was being cruel when there was no need. Althea, your mother loves you and will do a good job with your things. You know that. His softer tone brought the tears back to her eyes. Yes, you're right. Good night. She turned before he saw the tears. Braxton watched as she left, her back straight, her head high. She would cry herself to sleep, he was sure of it. And the guilt plagued him. He thought about chasing her but let her go. He would make it up to her when he had the opportunity. Chapter 6. Although Althea and Kala could have flown in half the time to the castle, and Braxton and Blake could have shifted and ran, in 3/4 of the time, Braxton had chosen to hire horses from the werewolves and ride through this part of the kingdom to, as he said, show off his new bride. Althea hadn't complained, nor had she really even spoken to him except to say good morning as they prepared to travel. Her eyes were puffy from tears and lack of sleep, which again pulled at his conscience. Althea, Mariah said, her hands on her daughter's shoulder, I'll miss you so very much. If it's all right with your husband, I'll visit once a week or so. Braxton stepped over, releasing the straps of the saddle to a servant to finish. He put his arm around his new mother-in-law and smiled. If you don't come, I'll be angry, he teased. Mariah smiled tearfully up at him, and he said, You and yours are welcome at our home any time you wish to come. Althea watched the exchange, her facial expression full of sadness. She narrowed her eyes only briefly before forcing herself to put on a bland expression. Mother, I'll miss you, she replied stiffly. Braxton moved away so they could speak privately as Tristan moved forward. Goodbye, my daughter. I will come with your mother when I'm able, Tristan told her, leaning forward to kiss her on the forehead. She allowed the gesture but did not return the affection. Mariah sighed and leaned close to her daughter's ear. I know you're angry and hurt, my love, but the gods are in favor of this union, I'm sure of it. The gods? I thought the only ones in favor of the union were you and Father. Some of her fiery spirit had returned. Braxton wanted to marry about as much as I did. And now we're stuck with each other. While you're missing me, think about that and the unhappiness you've condemned me to. Crueler words could not be spoken to a mother. Mariah's heart jerked in her chest as she watched her daughter mount the horse like a woman skilled in riding. Tristan, whose heart also ached, wanted to call his daughter back to make her apologize. But he had forced her into adulthood with this marriage, and his daughter was now a queen. She would forgive them for this, it would just take time. He felt his wife's shoulders shake with her tears, so he squeezed her tightly and lifted his hand to wave at the daughter whose back was straight and who didn't look back. Braxton had witnessed the farewell conversation, had heard the spiteful comment aimed at Mariah. Althea was hurting and had lashed out. He hadn't helped her with his behavior last night in his room. He felt responsible. No, he hadn't wanted to marry either, but he was determined to make the best of it. She expected a lifetime of misery. He would have to find a way to show her that they had a chance at happiness. They may never love each other, but they could find happiness with each other, he was sure of it. After all, their personalities were similar, and through questions he'd asked of Mariah, Tristan, and Kala, it was obvious they had hobbies in common. She was obviously strong and stubborn, two qualities necessary for a queen. Yes, he thought, we'll find common ground and we'll find happiness. He hoped, if not love, at least, eventually, they'd be able to find happiness. Althea and Kala spoke in hushed tones as they rode side by side several yards behind Braxton and Blake. Kala told her, "What you said to your parents was rather harsh, don't you think?" Althea's lips thinned. "Kala, I don't want to talk about that." "Okay, sure," Kala said. "Just keep something in mind as you sulk. This may not have been your choice, but it is now your life. How you deal with what comes is your choice." Kala spurred her horse and cantered to Braxton and Blake. Althea watched her, anger and guilt mixing in her heart. As Kala began a very animated conversation with the two men, and Althea felt jealousy join the amalgam of emotions. Pride wouldn't let her join them, no matter how much she wanted to. Lost in her own thoughts, she let the horse take the lead as she tried to see a way to be happy in this situation. The werewolf castle was everything it had been rumored to be. Darkly beautiful, the size was intimidating to the fairies, and Althea felt a daunting fear building inside her. The castle was nothing like the fairy castle she was used to. Her determination to find happiness in this situation began to falter. Braxton dismounted and walked over to assist Althea down from her horse. She smiled in thanks and allowed him to help her while Blake helped Kala. When her feet hit the ground, her legs felt shaky, and she clasped Braxton's hand with more strength than he had expected. "Are you okay?" he asked her, his arm going around her waist as he held her hand in his. "Just a little unsteady on my feet," she told him. "I've never ridden a horse so far. We usually fly." Braxton cursed inwardly at himself. He glanced at Kala, who seemed as unsteady as Althea. "I'm sorry, Althea. I honestly didn't even think about the fact that the two of you aren't used to riding." Althea smiled at him. "It's my fault. I could have asked for a break and didn't." "Me either," Kala murmured as she walked up to them slowly, rubbing her backside. "And I'm regretting it. Let's get the two of you to your rooms. As the king, I order you both to take hot baths and have good suppers," Braxton teased. Kala giggled. Althea offered him a weak smile. "A bath sounds heavenly." Braxton smiled at his bride and escorted her inside, with Blake and Kala following. "I think you'll like your rooms, Althea. You have a suite with a living area and a bedroom. Yours and mine are linked by an adjoining door between the bedrooms." Althea's stomach clenched at the idea of him being able to walk into her room at any time. But she retained her weak smile. "Sounds wonderful. Where is Kala's room?" "Like Blake's, she is close. Just down the hall and across from yours." "Thank you. It will be so comforting to have my best friend so close," Althea told him. As they walked through the halls of the castle, Althea saw the tapestry depicting the war between the werewolves and fairies. Her face showed her horror at the violence against the fairies and the blood represented by threads in various shades of red. Braxton cleared his throat, but Althea asked, "Is that the story your people share?" "Something like this, yes, though I think the weaver took some creative license. This was commissioned by my grandfather, whose father had participated in the war." Althea nodded. She looked at Braxton. Both sides have certainly embellished the truth. Braxton chuckled. I'm sure. Blake and Kala were standing behind them. Blake said, my hope, and the hope of everyone, is that your marriage will prevent any further bloodshed between our people. Braxton and Althea glanced at each other, both with doubt in their eyes. Kala laughed and broke the tension. Well, I for one am going to cause bloodshed if I don't get off my shaking legs soon. Everyone chuckled, and the tension was eased. Come on, lovely ladies, Braxton said as they continued down the hall and up a set of stairs. Let's get you two situated. I'll have your things brought up as soon as they arrive. Until then, I've had some clothes placed in your closets so you don't have to run around naked. Thank you, Althea said as she looked around. This place is massive. I hope I don't get lost. Just yell, Blake kidded. Someone will come find you. They rounded a corner, and Braxton indicated this was their hallway. As he led them to their rooms, a young man hurried up behind them, completely naked. Althea gasped and looked away, while Kala stifled a laugh. King Braxton, the chef requests a list of foods your bride and her friend like, the young man said. Thank you, Jeff. I'll have Althea and Kala make a list. He gestured to the ladies, aware of their discomfort, but this was too funny. Queen Althea, Kala, this is Jeff. He's one of the kitchen boys. He runs errands for our chef. Althea shook his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Jeff. Her voice was strained with repressed laughter. Kala smiled only. It is my pleasure. If you should need anything from the kitchens, please don't hesitate to ask for Jeff. He bowed and turned to leave. Althea stared after him, her eyes on his muscular behind, until Braxton cleared his throat. She glanced at him. He wore a grin so big his face looked like it hurt. So I probably should have warned you. Most werewolves are incredibly comfortable in the nude. Some don't wear clothes at all. Althea narrowed her eyes at him. You did that on purpose, she said with a giggle. The look on your face was priceless, he guffawed. The trio with him joined his laughter. He was just naked, Kala gasped as she laughed so hard tears slipped down her cheeks. Althea clutched her sides. Good gods! That was just too funny. Women too? More often it's men, but some of the ladies too, Blake told them. Wow, Althea mused. Kala, this is your room. We'll leave you in Blake's capable hands so I can show Althea hers, Braxton said. He took her hand and led her another 10 yards down the hall. He looked at her, a smile on his face. Before we go in, let me tell you that if there's anything you don't like, you can have it redecorated. I'm sure I'll love it, Braxton. I'm not that picky, she told him with a small smile. Her fear of entering the bedroom was almost palpable. What if he wants to have sex? I'm not ready, she thought. Braxton smiled at her. He was aware of her tension and had assumed correctly it was because she was nervous. He opened the door and gestured her inside. She smiled and preceded him. Her gasp was audible as she looked at the living area of her new home. The furniture was feminine and lovely, pieces she would have chosen for herself had she been asked to do so. To the left were the matching couch and chairs along with 2 end tables with lovely lamps atop. To the right, a desk with everything she could possibly need to conduct business, should she have any, organized on top and waiting for her to put it away. The chair was large and cushioned. Spacious and well-lit, Althea fell in love with the room and couldn't wait to see the bedroom. It's beautiful, Braxton, Althea complimented. Did you do this? I helped, but I can't take credit completely, he told her. Several of the ladies who work in the castle helped me. Well, they have lovely taste, Althea said as she ran her hands across the top of the couch. She looked at him and asked, "Can I see the bedroom and bathroom?" "Of course," he said and gestured to a door straight across from the entrance. He followed her so he could see her face when she saw her room. The bed would be her favorite, he was sure. Althea nearly squealed when she saw the bed. A four-post style bed with a canopy of flowing tulle the color of a pearl. The bedding was an iridescent blue with white pillows. "It will be like sleeping in the sky," she thought with a sigh. She turned to look at Braxton, her smile brighter than he'd seen since their wedding. "You like it?" She nodded, speechless. "Wait till you see your bathroom," he said with an eyebrow wiggle. She hurried to the door on her right and pushed it open. The tub was huge, deep enough to completely submerge her body, even in human size. Her bathtub at home was for fairies, she'd felt scrunched in it. "Braxton, this is wonderful," she gushed. "I love it." "I'm glad you like it," he replied with a smile. "Let me show you one more thing." He took her hand and led her out of the bathroom to a door in the wall to the left. He looked at her. "This is the door that leads to my room. My mother built this suite of rooms specifically for when I married. She said that way my wife and I could discreetly meet for, as she put it, relations." Althea swallowed nervously. Sex. He meant sex. She smiled weakly at him. He watched the return of her nerves. "Althea, I'm not going to force myself on you." "I would never do that," Braxton told her. He closed the door that led to his room. "I think we should get to know each other. Let's have dinner tonight." "I'm a virgin," Althea blurted unexpectedly. She slapped her hands over her mouth and giggled, her eyes wide in embarrassment. Braxton stared at her, trying not to laugh at her announcement. "Okay. I'm not sure what to say to that." Althea giggled again. "Oh my God, I'm sorry. That just shot out of my mouth." "No, it's better that I know. That way, when we do, he faltered and looked at her helplessly. "Become intimate," she finished. "Yes." He clapped his hands as if she'd given him the answer to the most important question. He was nervous too. "Have your bath and relax. I'll have a dinner brought up to us in 2 hours, and we'll enjoy each other's company." "Sounds nice. Thank you for being patient with me," Althea said, touching his arm. She hadn't touched him of her own accord until that moment. He liked it. "And don't put on fancy clothes. Be comfortable." "I'll probably show up in sweats," he told her. "Better than naked," she joked. They laughed together as he headed out the door. Exactly 2 hours later, a knock sounded on her door. She opened it and found 3 servants laden with trays of food and drink. Jeff, dressed now, though scantily in a pair of tiny shorts, greeted her with a huge smile. "Hello, again, my queen," Jeff said brightly. He set down a tray and directed the others to begin setting up the food. He leaned close to Althea as if to tell her a big secret. "King Braxton let us know in the kitchen that you aren't used to the nudity like we are, so I put on some clothes." Althea lifted an eyebrow at the questionable description of the tight shorts he wore. But she smiled. "Thank you, Jeff. I'm sure I will get used to the customs around here. I just had no idea werewolves wandered around nude." "Well, it beats buying new clothes every time we shift," Jeff said logically as he watched the other 2 servants finish setting up the food. "Will this do, my queen?" Althea glanced at the table and laughed. "There's enough food for 6 people. You've never seen a werewolf eat, I'll bet," Jeff teased. "Not really. Everything looks amazing. Thank you, Althea told him as Braxton walked in. Oh wow, perfect timing, he called. Jeff, it smells wonderful in here, and I'm starved. He turned to Althea and bent at the waist, taking her hand and kissing it. Hello, my beautiful wife. Althea's cheeks reddened at his display of affection. Hello, my husband, she replied. Completely charmed by the couple, Jeff beamed at them. You two are so lovely together. I can't tell you how thrilled everyone is over this marriage. Thank you, Jeff. Please send our yummy noises to Chef, Braxton said, politely dismissing him and the other servants. He turned to Althea. Shall we eat? Well, according to Jeff, if I don't make a plate before you do, I might not get any, Althea teased. Ah, he told you about the werewolf appetite, did he? Braxton sauntered to the table and looked at the various dishes, pork chops and grilled chicken, 3 vegetables, including salad and dressing, and 2 choices for dessert. There is a lot here, but you'd still better go first. Althea shook her head as she joined him at the table. She filled her plate and took her seat. She poured them each a glass of wine while he added food to his plate. After he'd taken his seat, she lifted her glass. What should we toast to? You seem better with words than I am. Braxton gave it some thought. How about we toast to a happy marriage? Althea looked down, frowning. He set his wine glass down. Althea, I know you didn't want this, and neither did I, if we're being honest. But you seem like the type of person I can get along with. I hope you feel the same way about me. I do. You're a nice man, I think, Althea said. When he looked at her, she winked. To a happy marriage. They clinked their glasses together and sipped. Wow, that's really good wine. Are you trying to get me drunk? Well, I hope I don't have to, he said with a smile. Now, let's eat before my rotten temper rears its ugly head. She laughed and they dug in. Dinner passed with good conversation. They got to know each other a little better, discovering exactly how much they had in common. Althea relaxed in his presence when she discerned that this marriage, while not born of love, would at least begin with friendship. She sat back, replete. I can't wait to meet your chef and compliment him on his amazing food. Braxton was plowing through his second plate when she finished. The man is a genius with food. I was disappointed that he couldn't come to the wedding and make the food for the reception. Too bad indeed, Althea sighed. I would have been too full of good food to act like such a bitch. Braxton chuckled. I didn't notice. Althea laughed. May I kiss you? Althea smiled and nodded. He leaned close to her and gently touched his lips to hers. His hand moved to her face and cupped her cheek gently. The same sensation she'd felt when he'd kissed her at their wedding shot through her, however, it was stronger this time. He had given her a sweet peck on the lips, this kiss was quickly becoming something else. I'm so okay, Althea answered without opening her eyes. He chuckled and pulled her against him after rolling off her. She fell asleep almost instantly, and he lay holding her until his eyes drifted closed as well. Chapter 7. Althea woke up alone the next morning, a little sore but otherwise content. She lay there for some time, thinking she needed another bath to relieve a different kind of soreness. Her giggle slipped out of her. A knock on the bedroom door startled her into full wakefulness. She pulled the covers over her body and called for the knocker to enter. Kala poked her head. Good morning, Queenie. It's awfully late for you to still be in your bed. Althea sat up and squealed, I had sex. Kala laughed at her. Of course you did. You're a married woman. She plopped down on the bed beside her best friend with a smile on her face. I guess you liked it. I sure did and can't wait to do it again. Althea exclaimed. Well, my friend, you'll have to do it in tens or ins. We start the tour of the kingdom in less than a week, Kala reminded her. Althea flopped back on her pillows. I completely forgot we were supposed to do that. But at least the weather is nice. Yes, it will be a lovely trip, Kala said. You should talk to Braxton about occasionally allowing you to shrink him to fairy size to show his willingness to understand our lives. I hadn't thought about that either, Althea mused, wondering if her husband would allow it. He hadn't seemed keen on the idea the night of their wedding, but then again, she'd been expecting him to live like that permanently. She rose and walked to the closet to dig out a robe. She glanced back at Kala. Have our things arrived? Not yet, but they should be here within the hour, I think, Kala informed her. Are you going to be given a maid or anything like that? Althea shrugged. No idea. I didn't have a personal maid at home. Don't really need one. Why? Just wondering, Kala commented. Braxton doesn't seem to have a personal manservant or anything like that. Blake told me he prefers to handle most things himself. Blake told you? Althea lifted an eyebrow. What were you doing with Blake? Well, you deserted me on my first night here. Kala defended. Blake asked if I wanted to eat with him, so I did. You like him? Althea gushed and rushed over to her friend. You do, don't you? Kala's eyes drifted to the left. Maybe a little. That's fantastic. My best friend, his best friend. Love it. Don't get your hopes up, Kala told her. Right now we're just friends. Okay. A knock sounded on the door to her suite. Come in. Jeff stuck his head in the room, his standard grin on his face. Good morning, my queen. Hello, Kala. How did you sleep? Wonderfully, thank you, Jeff. Althea beckoned him into the room, and he walked pushing a tray filled with breakfast foods. Oh, wow. Thanks, Jeff. Don't thank me, thank your husband. We still haven't received that list of foods from the two of you, he admonished playfully as he unloaded the cart. So I have a little bit of everything. Some fruits, eggs, sausage, bacon, biscuits, and bagels along with 3 types of jelly and butter. And you can choose from milk, juice, or coffee, or a combination, he finished with a flourish. Thank you so much, Jeff, Althea gushed. She squeezed his arm in a show of affection, a smile on her face as she sat. She gestured for Kala to sit across from her. You are most welcome, my queen, Jeff pronounced with a small bow. Jeff, please call me Althea, she offered. His eyes widened as if she'd threatened to behead him. Oh no, my queen, that would be disrespectful. I am a mere servant. Actually, you are my first friend here, Althea pointed out as she ladled eggs onto her plate. So you should call me Althea. You called Kala by her first name. But she is not the queen, Jeff argued. Althea shook her head and pointed her fork at him. I'll win you over yet, Jeff. He bowed and excused himself, grinning at her playfulness. As he opened the door, Braxton and Blake were walking in. Ah, good morning, my king. How are you? Fantastic, Jeff. How's Chef treating you this morning? Well, you know him. The delivery was late, so he's in a mood, Jeff told him with a wink. Not surprising, Braxton murmured. However, I'm not sure Chef has ever been in a good mood. Yes. He's an angry man. Jeff laughed with him and excused himself, closing the door behind him as he left. Braxton walked to the table and kissed Althea soundly on the lips before taking his seat. Blake rolled his eyes at Kala, who giggled. "Good morning, ladies. May we join you?" Braxton asked. "Of course." Jeff brought enough food for 6 people, Althea said with a shake of her head as the 2 men began filling plates. "I asked Jeff to call me Althea, but he refused." "Is that a rule here?" Braxton finished chewing before answering. "Not really. Chef is a slave driver, though, and does have strict rules. Jeff could if he chose to, but he doesn't want to anger Chef." "I am very interested in meeting this chef," Althea mused. She pictured a large man with hands like a bear's and a torso like a tree trunk, frightening in his capacity as head of the kitchens. "I don't think that's a good idea," Blake said, a twinkle in his eye. "Why?" "The ladies just love Chef." "He might steal you away," Braxton told her. Althea's curiosity was piqued. She'd head down there as soon as they'd finished breakfast. "All right, Blake and I are actually here on business." "What business is that?" "We are leaving for our tour of the kingdom on Thursday. I plan to travel for about a month or so, staying in various villages, werewolf and fairy. I've already heard of fairies moving across the border to settle near werewolf villages, and the werewolves like it," Braxton said, his amazement clear in his face. "Well, you know, a relationship between the fairies and werewolves is mutually beneficial," Kala pointed out. All eyes turned on her, so she continued. "Think about it. Werewolves can protect fairies from outside, physical harm, while fairies can use their magic to help ease some burdens from werewolves. As long as no one takes advantage, it's a brilliant plan." "You're a genius," Althea told her, grinning at her best friend. She turned her attention to Braxton. "I'm excited to go. I've met only a handful of werewolves in my life, most of them in the last 3 days." Mutual laughter echoed through her room. The foursome enjoyed their breakfast together like old friends. On Thursday, everyone was up early and ready for the trip. Again, they had chosen horses for travel so everyone could stay together, though Althea and Kala had magicked the gear to float behind them as if being borne by invisible horses. The werewolves were fascinated by the floating cargo. The small children kept ducking under it and poking at it like some beast they could figure out. Mothers stepped forward and chased them away, apologizing to the royal couple for the intrusion. The party included Braxton, Althea, Blake and Kala as well as a small retinue of guards who would be in werewolf from. When the men and women had shifted, the 4 horses had spooked, one almost tossing Kala to the ground. It was decided the guards would travel close but not too close to the 4 in a wide circle so they were covered from all sides. Braxton called to the group, "Everyone ready?" At the numerous sounds of assent, both in words and yips, he yelled, "Let's ride, then." They arrived at the first werewolf village just at lunch. A huge welcoming party awaited them, and a large feast had been prepared for the visitors. The village was happy to see the king and queen and were thrilled at the prospect of a united kingdom. Some of the older villagers, the ones who had barely been alive when the war between the fairies and werewolves had ended, thought the idea was ludicrous and were against it, but out of respect for Braxton and Braxton's mother, they did not speak their opinions loudly. Most of the villages, werewolf and fairy, greeted the royal visitors happily and with lots of food. More than once, Althea commented that her dresses would no longer fit if they continued to eat at feasts every single day, and Braxton would tell her she looked perfectly beautiful. They made love almost every night, unashamed of their need for each other. Althea would giggle if she cried out too loud and would clap her hand over her mouth, while Braxton had no worries about what people heard when they made love. Their final destination was the village Mariah had spoken about, the village where fairies and werewolves had been living in harmony for decades. As they rode into the village, fairies in their natural size as well as human size greeted them, holding hands with their werewolf spouses as if that were the norm all over. "I like this place," Althea commented as they dismounted. "I mean, all of the villages have been welcoming, but this place seems so serene." Blake stepped up beside her. "These people have lived together the way all werewolves and fairies should. They live a life of love and peace, all the time. Disputes, when there is one, are settled by a council made up of 2 of each species. I'm hoping we'll form a council similar to the one here for the entire kingdom." "Blake is my political hero," Braxton said as he took Althea's hand. "He wants this kingdom to be great, just like I do. But he has the knowledge to make it happen." "And you have the power," Blake said with a wink as they were greeted by the council they'd just been discussing. Althea's attention was pulled from the polite inquiries from the council to the people around them. Several were children, and she could tell they were of fairy and werewolf descent. One of the council members, an ancient fairy female, saw her interest in the children. "Queen Althea, I see you find our children interesting," the woman said knowingly. "I do. Braxton and I am sure, will one day have children." "Neither of us have met a mixed child," Althea told her. The woman took her hand and led her to a group of children of all ages. Kala followed, curious as well. "The children are fascinating, I'll admit. I wasn't sure about them either, at first. But when the first was born here, I knew everything would be fine." "What do you mean?" Althea asked her. "Each child is born in werewolf form, which our werewolf brethren said was not usual for a full werewolf infant. However, after a few days, the child would shift into human form. Every child, as they grew, had the ability to shift into werewolf form, but they also had some form of magical fairy ability. A mixed child will never be as magical as a full fairy child, not when they're born, nor as they grow into adulthood." "But they are healthy? Normal?" Althea asked, her worst fear that her child would be handicapped in some way. "Healthier than werewolf or fairy babies, I'll tell you that," the fairy cackled. "These mixed children, some of whom are adults now, are never sick. If they are injured, they heal much faster than either a fairy or a werewolf." I was amazed. Althea and Kala exchanged a happy glance. "Thank you so much. You have put so many of my fears to rest." "Of course, child. Now come, let's rejoin the council and king. We've prepared a banquet in honor of your visit." Althea groaned inwardly, and she and Kala exchanged another glance, this one of resignation. "Everyone in the village is looking forward to meeting you." That night after the banquet, Althea and Braxton retreated to their room in the inn for bedtime. Their bellies full, they were content to hold each other rather than engage in intercourse. As they lay cuddled together, Althea thought about the children they had met that day. "I really enjoyed this village, more than any other," Althea told him. "Yes," he whispered, his mouth close to her ear and his breath tickling her. She adjusted their position, laying on her back so she could turn her head to look at him. "The children are fascinating. Each one is slightly different from any other. I will tell you, I felt much relief when I met them. Now I can't wait to meet our children," Braxton told her. "You were afraid before?" "A little. I had never met a mixed child. I had no idea if they were like other children or if they had," he trailed off. "Defects?" she supplied. "Yes. You worried too?" "I did, but not anymore. When we are ready, I'll be excited to meet our children as well," she said. She lifted her head just a bit and kissed his lips. She prepared to roll over to sleep when his voice halted her movements. I'm ready, Althea. A child is the best way to solidify this kingdom. An heir to the throne will halt any claims from outsiders, Braxton said. Althea frowned. Braxton, a child is not a thing to be used as a pawn. I didn't say that. I said it will solidify the kingdom. But that sounds so impersonal. My child will be more than a way to bring this kingdom together, Althea argued. Our child will be both, Braxton said. I know you feel as if you were used when you were forced to marry me, but this has nothing to do with that. Althea narrowed her eyes as she sat up and looked down at him. It has everything to do with that. We won't treat our child like he or she is a pawn in the political game. I won't allow it. Braxton also sat up. Don't get defensive, Althea. I agree that we shouldn't do that. However, sometimes, as royalty, we are forced to do things we don't want to do. Such as this marriage? She asked, hurt by his implication. Anger leapt into his eyes. I am well aware you didn't want this marriage, Althea. No need to throw it in my face. He rose and began to dress. You didn't want this marriage either, so don't pretend you were okay with it and I'm the only one who didn't want it. Althea watched him as he dressed. Where are you going? To sleep elsewhere. What? He shoved his feet into his boots and rose. At the door, he said, I honestly thought we were doing well in this marriage. I didn't realize you harbored negativity for me still. I will leave the room and give you your space. He jerked the door open and slammed it after him. Althea stared at the door, shocked. A simple conversation had turned into a horrible miscommunication. She had grown happy in this marriage, and even though she wouldn't admit it to Braxton or anyone else, she had fallen in love with him over the last few weeks. After their first night together, the sex had gotten better and better. As she had grown closer to him during their travels, she had enjoyed his company more and more. He was funny, intelligent, and caring. He loved his people and would do anything for them. He was a good king. He was attentive to her and her needs, always making sure she had what she needed to be comfortable. Why wouldn't she fall in love with him? And she was pretty sure the child they had just fought over already grew in her belly. She wasn't sure yet, she was only a few days late, and her body hadn't changed yet. But she felt different. In a week she would know for sure. And now this. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she laid back down and attempted to sleep. How will I tell him? And how will I keep my child from being used as I was used? Really, if she was being honest, Braxton had allowed himself to be used as well. But she wouldn't put her child through that. Yes, her relationship with Braxton, tonight notwithstanding, was turning out to be a good thing, but that didn't mean it would remain so. Sighing, she closed her eyes as tears continued to escape her eyes and fall onto the pillow. As they packed the horses, Kala stepped to Blake and said, "Those two are being really strange this morning." "Yes, I noticed," he mused as he watched the king and queen carefully avoiding each other, speaking only when they had to. "I wonder what happened." "I know one thing that's happened." She looked at him blandly. "They have fallen in love accidentally." "Do people fall in love accidentally?" Blake smirked. "They did," Kala said with a giggle. "I wonder if they even know it." Blake watched Kala as she followed their friends with her eyes. "You're a romantic." She glanced at him again. "Yeah. A little." Braxton called out, "Let's get moving. I want to be at the castle before dark." His tone suggested they get on their horses immediately without any argument. He rode ahead of everyone else, his back straight. He needed time to think. His conversation with Althea last night had taken a bad turn. He had no intention of using their child as a pawn, but Althea's behavior had been so defensive, as if she truly believed he would do that. After these few weeks, spending so much time together, he had thought she'd know him better. Apparently not. And damn it, he'd fallen for her. When the hell had that happened? He shook his head at himself. This had to be fixed. If the two of them were going to have a happy marriage, these small bickering fights would have to cease. He was not under the false idea that married couples didn't fight, but he felt like he and Althea were way too uncomfortable with each other. He blamed it on the fact that they hadn't known each other before they married. As they rode, he listened to Althea chat quietly with Blake and Kala, and his mind began to contemplate all the ways he could make her happy. He wanted her to fall for him too, so he had to do some wooing. She would be receptive, he was sure of it. He could see something in her eyes when they looked at each other. They would work together. Braxton let his horse slow so he could join the conversation going on behind them. He wouldn't apologize to Althea now, but he would later. "What are you giggling about back here?" Althea looked at Braxton and smiled a small smile. "Blake was telling us a story about when the two of you were little. What a couple of troublemakers you were." The smile she had given him had warmed his heart. "Oh no. Which story? How many are there?" Althea laughed. "So many I couldn't tell them all on this trip," Blake said with a chuckle. "Which one were you telling?" Braxton asked again, a smile on his face. "Remember when we were teenagers and snuck out of the castle to meet those two hot chicks?" Blake asked, slapping his thigh. "Hey, now, this is my wife." Braxton teased. "You can't tell her about my conquests." The group laughed, and Blake opened his mouth to tell the story when a werewolf burst out of the forest on their left, spooking the horses. Althea's reared, but she held her seat. The others attempted to bolt but were controlled by their riders. Once they had their horses under control, Braxton leapt off his and approached the werewolf, now in human form. "What the hell is wrong with you? We're on horses." The poor kid was terrified and cowered under Braxton's anger. "You could have seriously injured one of us." "I'm so sorry, King Braxton," the kid stammered. "What is so important that you burst out of the bushes like that?" "I have an urgent message for you from the castle," the kid breathed. He handed a piece of paper to Braxton and stepped away. Braxton glared at him as he opened the message. Blake had dismounted, encouraging the women to remain on their horses. They were only 3 miles from the castle and could see its turrets over the tree line. He moved to Braxton and read over his shoulder. "Son of a bitch," he murmured angrily after reading. Braxton dismissed the messenger with a growl and looked at Blake. "What the hell?" "It would seem your marriage to Althea has brought your brother out of hiding," Blake grumbled. Chapter 8. "Your brother?" Althea asked as they rode at a faster pace than earlier. "What's going on?" "My brother was incredibly unhappy that my mother chose me to take the throne. He disappeared after the decision was final, leaving the kingdom, as far as I or anyone else knew." Braxton looked at her. "If he's back, he has nefarious plans, I can assure you. Your meeting him will be ugly, I'm sure." "Do I have to meet him?" Althea asked, concerned. "Yes," Blake answered. "He'll cause a ruckus until he does. Jonathan is best handled in a straightforward manner." "He's angry Braxton married?" Althea was still confused. Braxton answered. "He's angry because I married a fairy." If he'd been chosen as king, he would have started another war with your people with the idea of obliterating the species completely. Althea's lips pressed together. I look forward to meeting this brother, she said, her voice hard as iron. Braxton smiled. He had not married a weak woman who would stand behind him and do as told. While he might regret that on occasion, he would not have her any other way. She was perfect for him, a balance he'd seen in her parents that he hoped they achieved as they continued to learn about each other. When they reached the castle, servants rushed forward to take the horses to the stables. With a brief thank you, Braxton took his wife's hand and strode into his castle with confidence. Blake and Kala followed. Althea wished she had a moment to refresh herself after the long ride. She felt dirty and unpresentable, but this was not the time for niceties. The brother, Jonathan, would meet her as is. Jonathan was in the hall close to Braxton's office. He stared at the tapestry depicting the war between the werewolves and fairies, a sly smile on his face. When he heard their footsteps, he turned, causing Braxton's mouth to open in surprise. His face, which had once been handsome with its ice blue eyes and perfectly shaped nose, had been marred at some point. A huge scar extended from his right ear to his chin, giving the man a dangerous look. Jonathan grinned wickedly at the group, but his eyes were on Braxton. He touched his scar. "Ah, little brother, you do not like my scar?" Braxton gathered himself and smiled blandly at his brother. "Only that it mars the resemblance we share as brothers." Jonathan's eyebrow raised at the reminder of family ties. "Brothers, yes." His eyes moved to Althea, who did not flinch from his gaze. "And this must be your fairy wife." Althea stepped forward, her hand extended. "Hello, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to meet you at last." "So you've heard of me, then?" He took her hand and held it longer than necessary. "Of course." Althea did not pull her hand away, though she felt a tremor of dismay. "Braxton tells me you've been gone for some time. I'd love to hear the stories of your adventures." Jonathan stared at her a moment, then threw back his head and barked a laugh. He looked at Braxton and finally released her hand. "She's brave, though perhaps a little stupid." "Excuse me?" Althea asked, outrage in her countenance. Braxton took her hand. "Refrain from expelling comments about my wife." "Of course," Jonathan said, eyeing the pair with conniving eyes. He looked up at the tapestry. "Lovely, isn't it?" Braxton rolled his eyes. "Jonathan, you are not here to discuss the beauty, or lack thereof, of the tapestries. We've just come from a long journey in Dash." "Yes, I heard. How wonderful to travel through the kingdom. I'm sure you saw nothing but happiness and glee at the prospect of this marriage and integration of werewolves and fairies." His voice was grating, harsh, and had she been alone with him, Althea would have been terrified despite the words he used. "As I was saying, we need to freshen up. I'll have Chef prepare dinner for the 5 of us." "7 good for you?" Braxton continued. "7 is fine, brother," Jonathan replied. "I'll be in my old chambers." "I assume they are still mine?" "No one has been in there for any purpose other than cleaning since you left," Braxton informed him. He took Althea's hand and led her away. "We'll see you at 7. Jonathan marched off in the other direction, and Althea felt the tension leave her body as well as Braxton's once they were away from his brother. "Wow," she murmured to him as they walked. "Your brother is a piece of work." "That's diplomatic," Braxton laughed quietly. "You held your ground. I'm proud of you." "There are men who cower from him because he looked at them." "I was terrified." "But he wasn't going to see it," Althea told him. "And he won't ever see it." Braxton nodded. Yes, he had been given the wife he needed. She would balance him, she would defend him, and she would care for him. She would stand with him. When they reached her door, he took her in his arms and hugged her tightly. Kala had entered her room, and Blake walked past them to his without a word. Althea, thank you, Braxton murmured into her hair. For what? For being the kind of woman I need by my side, Braxton said quietly. I know we're going to argue. We wouldn't be normal if we didn't. But the longer I know you, the more I realize that you are the right woman to help me rule this kingdom. Althea stared into his eyes, her words stolen by his declaration. It wasn't of love, but it was close, and her heart swelled with love. She kissed him soundly on the lips, and the kiss deepened. He pressed her up against her door, his hands moving up and down her body. Neither cared that they were in the hallway and might be seen. Her hands were in his hair, holding him to her. She wanted him, now, but they didn't have the time. She pulled away, panting as the desire to jerk him into her room tried to win over her sense of duty. Braxton, as much as I want you right now, we don't have time. But we're going to finish this little scene later. Braxton smiled. That's what I mean about balance. Because I don't care if we're late to dinner. He kissed her neck and tried to convince her with little murmurs of what he would do her if they went to her room together. Althea giggled and shied away from him, opening her door and stepping inside. When he tried to follow, she put a hand on his chest. Now, King Braxton, go to your room and get dressed. I promise, we'll finish this tonight. And it will be so worth the wait. Braxton growled at her. Woman, you kill me. He winked at her and turned to walk down the hallway, adjusting himself as he did so. Althea giggled when she closed the door, then hurried to draw a bath so she would be presentable at dinner. She thought about locking the door between her room and Braxton's, but decided against it. That door should never be locked. Braxton and Althea sat at the head of the banquet table in the great hall, with Blake on Althea's right. Kala had chosen not to join them for dinner. Jonathan made her terribly uncomfortable and she did not want to be in his presence. She had apologized to Braxton after speaking her mind, but he had assured her that most people felt the same way and he was in no way offended. Jonathan arrived 10 minutes late, his little dig at Braxton. Dinner was served 5 minutes later, and the group ate in silence, saving the conversation for after. Althea ate slowly, her eyes on anything in the room other than Jonathan, but she caught him staring more than once, his eyes narrowed. Once the servants had collected the plates and served coffee, Braxton opened the discussion. All right, Jonathan, let's hear it. Why are you here? And where the hell have you been? All over, little brother, on adventures in other kingdoms you couldn't even dream of, Jonathan boasted. Sounds great, Braxton deadpanned. So why are you back if the adventures were so amazing? Jonathan chuckled. No curiosity? Not even a little? I've never been the adventurous type, Braxton reminded him blandly. Ah, well, I bet your fairy wife is disappointed to hear that, he commented snidely, his double meaning quite clear to all at the table. Althea maintained her dignity, remaining quiet at the small insult. She was sure there were several more to come. Mind your manners, brother, Braxton warned amiably, his voice hiding the anger. So I take it you are unhappy in my choice of bride? Unhappy? I'm downright disgusted, Jonathan claimed. Those creatures are pathetic. They need someone to rule over them, not someone who wants to be their equal. He pretended to think, lifted a finger, and said, Ah, so that's why you married one. She can be your little sex slave. Braxton's jaw clenched. Althea put her hand on his thigh under the table to calm him. He smiled at Jonathan. Why are you here? I am here to make a formal challenge for the throne. Blake hissed. A formal challenge? Your mother, and the people of this kingdom, chose Braxton. You have no claim. Jonathan waved a dismissing hand at Blake. Yes, best friend, thank you for your incorrect assessment. If I make a formal challenge, Braxton must accept. Blake turned and looked at Braxton, whose eyes hadn't left his brother. Althea had no idea what a formal challenge meant. Braxton, what does he mean? Your husband must fight me to the death to keep his throne, Jonathan answered, watching Althea's face. He enjoyed the shock and fear that appeared there. What? She turned to Braxton. Is he telling the truth? A fight to the death? That's crazy. Braxton smiled at her but spoke to Jonathan. Jonathan, is this really what you want? To kill or be killed over the throne? I will make a better king than you will, Braxton. You are weak, in every sense of the word, and cannot rule as competently as I can. Braxton is the best king this kingdom will ever know, Blake shouted, rising from his chair to defend his best friend and liege. He has brought peace in his short reign. You will bring war. Jonathan laughed at the display. He rose as well to make his parting comments. The fairies do not deserve the same luxuries werewolves possess. I will put them back in their place as king and restore this kingdom to its former glory. He looked at Althea. I hope you like the tapestry in the hall. Life will soon imitate art. He returned his gaze to Braxton. Tomorrow morning, in the West Field, at 10. After he left, Althea turned to Braxton. This can't happen. You can't fight your brother for the throne. He cupped her face in his hand. Althea, I have no choice. He's made a formal challenge, which I'm sure he'll spread all over by morning. Either I fight or forfeit the throne. Blake rose. I'll have the Westfield prepared for the battle. He left the room without another word. Althea stared after him. He seems so unconcerned. That's his way. This fight is inevitable, Braxton said. Let's go upstairs. I want to speak with you in a more private setting. In her room, Braxton sat her down on the bed. Althea, I have to tell you something. Okay, Althea murmured, her fear that he would tell her some other strange custom the werewolves followed. He detected the fear in her voice. He sat next to her and took her hands in his. Don't be scared. This is good, he assured her. Althea laughed a little, her disbelief clear. Just tell me. I've fallen in love with you, he gushed. I have to fight tomorrow. If I'm unsuccessful, I don't want to die without you knowing that. If you're unsuccessful? You won't be, Althea affirmed. And I love you too. That's why I'm terrified right now. Don't be. I've been fighting my whole life. Werewolves are born to it. He leaned over to her and kissed her, his hand on her thigh. Now, I believe you promised we'd finish what we started earlier. The next morning, Althea walked with Braxton to the Westfield. He had asked her to stay at the castle, but she had refused. Kala walked next to her, and Blake was beside Braxton carrying a bow and a quiver of arrows, giving him advice. Blake knew that Jonathan had visited certain areas of the world where they taught different fighting techniques than Braxton might be familiar with. He was listing ways to defend himself. Okay, Blake, that's enough, Braxton told them as they reached the circle Blake had prepared for the fight. I'm as ready as I'll ever be. He turned to Althea. I wish you would go back. I won't, Althea said with a shake of her head. I love you. I love you, Braxton told her, cupping her face with his hand. He began to undress. Will you hold my clothes for me? Althea laughed. Of course, you brazen hussy. He laughed with her. Jonathan sauntered into the circle, already nude. His body was marked with the scars of battles, and Althea wondered what his werewolf form would look like. In human form, he was the same size as Braxton, so she assumed they would be equal as wolves as well. Good morning, Queen, Jonathan called, waving to her. Enjoy that title now, for it will not be yours long. Althea rolled her eyes at him, which irritated him if the clench of his jaw was any indication. She turned back to Braxton. Good luck, my love. He smiled at her and turned to face her brother, his face stern and angry. Anything to say before we shift? Well, you should say goodbye to your bride, Jonathan barked. Also, no interference from the little fairy, or my man will shoot her. He indicated with his head a man with a bow and arrow in the notch and ready should he need it. Your man aims at my wife, and mine will kill him. Braxton waited for Jonathan's acknowledging nod, which meant nothing. She will not interfere. Jonathan looked at Althea and waited. She called, neither me nor my friend will use magic to interfere. What about your fairy guards? Yes, I've noticed them, Jonathan said. Althea looked around, frowning. She had been so concerned about Braxton, she hadn't noticed they were encircled by fairies in their war garb. Braxton promised they won't interfere either, unless they feel the queen is in danger. A subtle warning, if Jonathan won, he could not harm Althea. I agree. Let's shift. Jonathan shifted before the word had left his mouth completely. Braxton followed. Both wolves howled and charged simultaneously in a blur of fur and teeth. Snarls, growls, and the sounds of snapping teeth filled the west field. Althea cringed as she watched her husband and his brother try to kill each other. The battle was short, however, though bloody. Jonathan drew first blood, scoring Braxton's chest with his claws. Braxton fell back, rolling, and managed to regain his feet quickly. Blood seeped from the wound, but Braxton lowered his head and charged again. He slammed his shoulder into Jonathan's chest, and they bowled over, kicking up dust around them. Braxton's teeth latched onto Jonathan's throat, but Jonathan managed to shake him off. Braxton used his claws and dragged them down Jonathan's spine, creating wounds much deeper than the ones on his chest. Blood spattered the ground as the pair circled one another to catch their breath. Althea wished they could speak while in wolf form. Braxton was breathing hard, but Jonathan was wheezing. He arched his back and a whimper escaped him before he could stop it. Blood also dripped from a tear at Jonathan's throat caused by Braxton's teeth. Althea winced again, sorry that he was in pain but not sorry Braxton was still all right. Braxton advanced once more. Jonathan retreated a few steps, then sprinted at Braxton. They slammed into each other, snarling and growling louder than before. A yelp sounded, and Jonathan lay on the ground, unmoving though breathing and awake. Braxton backed away several feet and shifted. The wounds on his chest looked much worse in human form, and his nose and lips were bleeding. He'd have several bruises all over his body tomorrow. Althea wanted to run to him, but Blake grabbed her arm and shook his head. She looked back at the pair. I don't want to kill you, Jonathan, Braxton said. Don't make me. Shift into human form. Jonathan made a sound deep in his throat in response but did not shift. Brother. Shift. The almost pleading note in Braxton's voice broke Althea's heart. He did not want to kill his own brother but would if he had to. And it would weigh on him for the rest of his life. Jonathan looked at Braxton, then down at the ground. He howled and shifted, his howl becoming a scream of agony. He growled at Braxton, "You know how much more this hurts as a human." "I do. But I need your word you'll leave and not return. If you do return, I'll have you killed before you reach the castle." Braxton sounded hard, cold, but inside his heart was breaking. Jonathan stared at him. "I'll go, little brother. But I will not give up the throne. If you want me gone, you'll have to kill me." Braxton stared at him, indecision clear in his eyes. He looked at Blake, who nodded. Althea gasped, and Braxton's eyes moved to her. She shook her head as tears fell down her cheeks. Blake looked at the ground. She would win this, and he prayed to the gods no harm would come from it. "Guards!" Braxton yelled. The fairy guards flew forward, closing the circle around the brothers. "Jonathan needs to heal, but he's dangerous in wolf form. He will shift so he can heal, but he must be held captive until he is deposited far from here." "Can you do that?" "King Braxton, we will bind him once he shifts and transport him magically to the location of his choice." "Or your choice," the leader of the fairy guards pronounced. Braxton nodded and named a land across the sea from this kingdom. "Yes, King." Braxton returned his attention to Jonathan. "Shift and heal." "Goodbye." Braxton turned and walked toward Althea and Blake. Blake stepped forward. "Braxton, you must kill him. I know it's hard, but he'll come back. What if he challenges you after you've started a family? Or when you're ill? Now is the time." "Blake, I can't. He's my brother. My sister would never forgive me, and I would never forgive myself. If he returns, I'll have him killed." "I promise to you," Braxton said. Blake sighed but stepped away so Braxton could reach Althea. "Braxton! I will return." "This isn't the end." Jonathan's words were cut off by the fairy guards, who had magically silenced him. Braxton watched as he tried to speak and finally gave up. He shifted, the fairies surrounded him, and he was gone. Tears of internal pain slid down his cheeks. He looked at Althea, who cried with him. "I have to shift to heal." "I'll stay with you," Althea promised. He shifted and lay on the grass. She dropped beside him and put his head in her lap. He closed his eyes. Forever. A month later, Braxton interrupted Althea, who was chatting with Chef and Jeff in the kitchens, laughing animatedly at something Jeff had said. "Althea, may I see you privately for a few minutes, please?" "I'll send her right back, guys," Braxton winked at the men. Chef waved his beefy arm and clucked his tongue. "Keep her. She's wearing me out with new recipes this week. You love everything I've brought you so far," Althea defended. He rolled his eyes at her as she scurried out to follow Braxton. "Where are we going?" "I have a surprise for you," Braxton teased. "You're going to love it." "A surprise?" "I love surprises," she squealed. "Is it a new tiara?" A running joke between the two, Braxton had promised her a new tiara after he'd sat on hers and destroyed it. "No, not a new tiara." "Geez, Althea, you have 4 others," Braxton whined. "Yes, but that was my favorite," she told him pointedly as she grabbed his hand. "And since we're handing out surprises, I have one for you too." "Oh, really? What is it?" Braxton asked as he halted and pulled her into his arms. After a rather passionate kiss, she playfully danced away from him. "Mine first. Then yours." "We're here," Braxton said, watching her face. She looked around, frowning. She didn't come in this hall often because she so despised the tapestry depicting the war. She avoided gazing in its direction when she walked this way, and did the same today. "What is it?" Braxton gestured to the tapestry, and Althea's eyes followed his pointing finger. She gasped and clapped her hands. "A new tapestry! It's wonderful, Braxton." The new tapestry was the scene from their wedding. She in her dress, he in his tux, holding hands in front of Theno. On one side the colorful fairies, and on the other side were the werewolves in their earth tones. Stunning, Althea was mesmerized. "How did you get it?" "Your mother." She let the fairy weavers in her mind so they could see the scene. "It will hang here forever," Braxton said. "We are the first werewolf king and fairy queen. We made history." "We're about to make history again," Althea told him as she gazed at the wedding scene in awe. "Gosh, I could sit here and look at this all day." "How are we going to make history again?" Braxton asked. Althea smiled as she turned her head. "I'm going to have the first mixed-breed royal child." "You're pregnant?" Braxton yelled, shocked. "Since when?" "Since just before the fight with Jonathan, I think," Althea said. Braxton grabbed her, lifted her, and twirled her around. Delighted, she laughed and screeched. "Damn, woman, I love you," he said as he lowered her to the ground. "I love you too." They shared another kiss, and this one wasn't going to end until they were in private. Braxton lifted her in a groom's hold and carried her to her bedroom, which had become their bedroom. They made careful, sweet love, happy that their kingdom was, for the moment, safe for their child. The end. A Fairy Tale Marriage by Mary T. Williams. A Romancely exclusive story. Get more free romance audiobooks at romancely.com.